What is it like to see the color red? What is it like to feel pain? What is it like to be you, right now, having conscious experience? For most of human history, these seemed like questions for poets, not scientists. But in a small office at UC Santa Cruz in the early 90s, these ancient mysteries were about to become one of the most rigorous challenges modern science has ever faced. The philosopher wrestling with these questions was David Chalmers, and he was about to transform how we think about minds, reality, and our technological future. The escalating questions that haunted this young philosopher weren't merely academic curiosities. They struck at the heart of everything we thought we knew about the relationship between brain and mind, between physical processes and subjective experience. Whilst neuroscience was making extraordinary progress, mapping neural circuits, and cognitive scientists were building increasingly sophisticated models of mental processing, something fundamental remained untouched. Something that seemed to slip through the net of scientific explanation, no matter how fine the mesh became. David Chalmers brought a unique background to these ancient puzzles. Born in Australia in 1966, he was trained first in mathematics and cognitive science before turning to philosophy, bringing analytical precision to questions that had puzzled humanity for millennia. This mathematical mind approached the most subjective aspects of human experience with unprecedented rigor, refusing to accept that consciousness must remain forever beyond scientific reach, whilst simultaneously recognizing why it posed such extraordinary challenges. In his landmark, 1996 work, The Conscious Mind, Chalmers crystallized the central insight that would define his career. The really hard problem of consciousness is that of experience. When we think and perceive, there is a whir of information processing, but there is also something it is like to have thoughts and perceptions. This wasn't philosophical wordplay. It was a precise diagnosis of why consciousness had remained so resistant to scientific explanation and why traditional approaches were doomed to miss the target entirely. The revolutionary insight emerged from a fundamental distinction that would reshape the entire field: the difference between easy problems of cognition and the hard problem of conscious experience itself. The easy problems, whilst technically demanding, concerned cognitive functions like attention, memory, perception, and behavioral responses. These could be explained through computational models and neural mechanisms. But the hard problem was altogether different. It asked why there should be any subjective experience accompanying these processes at all. This wasn't just another academic distinction, but a fundamental reconceptualization that challenged the entire physicalist worldview dominating modern science. In his famous paper, Facing Up to the Problem of Consciousness, Chalmers argued that explaining cognitive functions, whilst difficult, pales in comparison to explaining why there's subjective experience accompanying these processes. Why should information processing feel like anything from the inside? Why isn't the brain simply a sophisticated biological computer, processing inputs and generating outputs without any inner light of awareness? From this foundational insight flowed a series of contributions that would establish Chalmers as one of the most influential philosophers of mind in the contemporary world. Property dualism emerged as his naturalistic alternative to reductive physicalism, arguing that consciousness represents a fundamental feature of reality that cannot be reduced to purely physical processes. The extended mind thesis challenged traditional boundaries of cognition, suggesting that our minds extend beyond the biological boundaries of our skulls into the tools and technologies we use. His work on two-dimensional semantics provided sophisticated logical machinery to support his metaphysical arguments about consciousness and possibility. Part 1. The Hard Problem of Consciousness. David Chalmers revolutionized consciousness studies by drawing a distinction that grounds his entire philosophical project. In facing up to the problem of consciousnesses, he divided the study of mind into two fundamentally different categories. The easy problems of consciousness are those that seem directly susceptible to the standard methods of cognitive science, whereby a phenomenon is explained in terms of computational or neural mechanisms. This wasn't meant to trivialize these problems. They include attention, memory, the ability to report mental states, and the integration of information, but to highlight that they all share a common structure. They can be explained by describing the performance of cognitive functions. The easy problems, despite their name, represent genuine scientific challenges that cognitive science has made substantial progress on. When we ask how the brain focuses attention or stores memories, we're asking for an account of cognitive functions that can be answered through computational mechanisms and neural processes. Chalmers references specific examples, explaining how we discriminate stimuli, integrate information across sensory modalities, or access our own internal states. These problems, whilst technically difficult, don't pose conceptual mysteries because we understand what it would mean to solve them. We know the kind of explanation that would satisfy us, one that shows how neural circuits perform the relevant cognitive functions. The hard problem stands as fundamentally different in kind, not just degree. Chalmers formulates it precisely. The hard problem is that of experience. When we think and perceive, there is a whir of information processing, but there is also something it is like to have thoughts and perceptions. This isn't about explaining cognitive functions, but about explaining why there's subjective, first-person experience accompanying these processes at all. The mystery isn't how the brain processes information. That's an easy problem. But why processing information should feel like anything from the inside? This creates a conceptual puzzle that seems to resist the standard methods of science. Chalmers demonstrates how even if we completely mapped every neural process involved in perception, cognition, and behavior, we would still face the mystery of why these processes are accompanied by inner experience. His thought experiment illuminates this gap. We could imagine a complete neuroscientific account of vision that explains discrimination, integration, and reporting, without explaining why there's something it's like to see red. The redness of red, its qualitative, experiential character, seems to slip through the net of functional explanation. The hard problem represents a fundamental challenge to physicalist worldviews that assume everything can ultimately be explained in terms of physical processes. Physical science excels at describing structure and function, the patterns of neural firing, the computational transformations, the behavioral outputs. But conscious experience has qualities that seem irreducible to these structural descriptions. The warmth of sunlight on your skin, the melancholy of a minor chord, the sharp focus of concentrated attention. These experiential qualities appear to be something over and above the neural processes that underlie them. This distinction reveals the structure of the mind-body problem itself. The hard problem isn't just another scientific puzzle waiting for the right technology or theory. It's a conceptual challenge that forces us to reconsider our basic assumptions about the nature of mind and reality. Chalmers shows that physical processes, no matter how complex or sophisticated, seem insufficient to bridge the explanatory gap between objective brain states and subjective conscious experience. The question becomes not just how consciousness works, but why it exists at all. The explanatory gap stands as perhaps the most formidable obstacle to understanding consciousness within a purely physical framework. David Chalmers identified this conceptual chasm between objective physical processes and subjective conscious experience as the heart of what makes the hard problem so intractable. As Chalmers puts it, there is an explanatory gap between the functions and experience, and we need to build a bridge. This gap isn't merely about current limitations in neuroscience or cognitive science. It represents a fundamental conceptual problem about how objective, physical processes could possibly give rise to the rich, qualitative dimension of subjective phenomenal experience. The uniqueness of consciousness becomes starkly apparent when we contrast it with the history of successful scientific reductions, when chemistry was reduced to physics, or when biology was reduced to chemistry. We could understand how higher-level properties emerged from lower-level ones, because both levels were characterized in objective, structural terms. The properties of water emerged comprehensibly from the behavior of H2O molecules, because both water's macro properties and hydrogen and oxygen's micro properties could be described in terms of objective physical relationships. Temperature, pressure, molecular bonds. These concepts all operate within the same explanatory framework of objective, measurable phenomena. Consciousness presents an entirely different challenge. As Chalmers observes, in the case of consciousness, the problem persists even when we have explained the performance of all the cognitive and behavioral functions in the vicinity of experience. We might provide complete accounts of how the brain processes information, integrates sensory data, controls behavior, and even generates reports about internal states. Yet something crucial seems left out: felt quality of experience itself. The redness of red, the sharp sting of pain, the melancholy mood of a rainy afternoon. These phenomenal qualities appear to inhabit a different conceptual realm from anything physical science describes. The intuitive force of the explanatory gap emerges most clearly when we consider the limits of physical explanation. No matter how detailed our account of neural firing patterns, neurotransmitter release, and information processing becomes, there remains the persistent question of why these processes are accompanied by inner experience rather than occurring in the dark. We can map every neural correlation, trace every pathway, and model every computation involved in visual processing, yet the question remains, why should there be something it's like to see? Chalmers argues that we can coherently conceive of all these physical processes occurring without any accompanying experience. Zombie-like systems that process information and generate appropriate responses, whilst remaining experientially empty. This conceivability points towards something profound about consciousness. If consciousness were truly nothing over and above physical processes, there shouldn't be an explanatory gap at all. The relationship should be as transparent as the relationship between water and H2O molecules. As Chalmers puts it, if consciousness were logically supervenient on the physical, then we should be able to see a priori that the physical processes give rise to experience. The fact that we cannot see this connection, even in principle, suggests that consciousness involves something genuinely novel, irreducible, phenomenal properties that cannot be captured by purely physical description. The persistence of the explanatory gap thus challenges the core assumption of reductive physicalism, that consciousness is nothing over and above physical processes. If this gap reflects a genuine feature of consciousness rather than merely our current ignorance, then we need theoretical approaches that can accommodate irreducible conscious properties whilst remaining scientifically respectable. This recognition opens the door to exploring more precise arguments against physicalism. Arguments that contest whether the explanatory gap reflects deep metaphysical truths about the nature of mind and reality. Conscious experience possesses qualitative properties that resist capture by any purely structural description. David Chalmers identifies these intrinsic qualitative features as qualia, the irreducible aspects that make experience what it is from the inside. As he puts it, conscious experiences have qualitative properties. There is something it is like to have them. The qualitative properties of experiences are often called qualia. The redness of a red experience, the sharp sting of pain, or the warmth of sunlight on skin, these represent the felt qualities that seem to constitute the very essence of conscious experience itself. These qualitative properties appear fundamentally different from anything captured by physical science. When neuroscience describes the neural correlates of seeing red, specific patterns of activation in visual cortex, particular wavelengths of light, measurable responses in the retina, it provides a complete structural account of the physical processes involved. Yet something crucial seems missing from this description. The actual redness itself, the qualitative character that makes the experience what it is from the subject's perspective. No amount of structural detail about neural firing patterns or electromagnetic radiation appears to capture this intrinsic qualitative dimension. This points to a fundamental asymmetry between how we access conscious experience and how science studies it. When we introspect our own conscious states, we seem to encounter qualitative properties directly through first-person acquaintance. We don't infer the painfulness of pain from observing neural activity. We know it immediately through experiencing it. This direct acquaintance reveals aspects of experience that remain invisible to third-person scientific investigation, no matter how sophisticated our instruments or detailed our measurements. Chalmers argues that this asymmetry reflects a deeper conceptual issue about how we think about consciousness. Phenomenal concepts. Our concepts of conscious experiences operate through a fundamentally different mode of presentation than physical concepts. When we think about pain phenomenally, we employ the very experience of pain itself as our mode of access to what we're thinking about. Physical concepts, by contrast, refer to their objects through structural descriptions and causal roles. This creates what Chalmers calls conceptual isolation. Phenomenal concepts are conceptually isolated from physical concepts in a way that prevents a priori entailment from physical to phenomenal. This conceptual isolation carries metaphysical implications. If consciousness were truly identical to physical processes, then phenomenal and physical concepts should be conceptually connected in a way that allows us to derive facts about experience from purely physical information. The fact that no amount of physical description seems to logically entail the existence of qualitative experience suggests that conscious properties are not logically supervenient on physical properties. As Chalmers argues, the conceptual isolation of phenomenal concepts from physical concepts suggests that phenomenal properties are not logically supervenient on physical properties. The irreducible nature of qualia thus creates a puzzle for any reductive physicalist account of consciousness. If qualitative properties are genuinely distinct from structural properties, then it becomes conceivable that all the physical processes associated with consciousness could occur without the accompanying qualitative experience. The conceptual gap between phenomenal and physical concepts opens logical space for scenarios where the physical facts remain identical whilst the phenomenal facts differ or disappear entirely. Part 2. The Zombie Argument. Philosophical zombies represent David Chalmers' most devastating thought experiment against physicalism. though they bear no resemblance to the shambling undead of popular culture. These are not creatures risen from graves or infected by viruses. Chalmers defines a zombie with surgical precision. A zombie is someone or something physically identical to me, or to any other conscious being, but lacking conscious experiences altogether. This definition reveals the true target of his argument, not some fantastical monster, but a being that would be molecularly identical to any conscious human, exhibiting identical behaviors, responses, and even verbal reports about inner experience, yet possessing no actual phenomenal consciousness whatsoever. The zombie would function as a perfect mimic of consciousness, whilst remaining phenomenally vacant inside. Consider what such a being would be like in practice. Your zombie duplicate would wake each morning, stretch, and comment on feeling refreshed after a good night's sleep. It would wince when stepping on a sharp stone, not from any felt pain but from the same neural processing that causes you to wince. It would write poetry about the beauty of sunsets, discuss the rich redness of roses, and even engage in philosophical debates about the nature of consciousness itself. The zombie would claim to experience the taste of chocolate, the warmth of sunlight, the melancholy of autumn evenings. It would insist, with apparent sincerity, that it possesses rich inner experience. Yet, according to Chalmers' conception, all this behavior would occur in the absence of any actual qualitative experience. The zombie's neural networks would process information about wavelengths of light, but there would be no experienced redness accompanying this processing. Its pain receptors would trigger withdrawal behaviors without any felt sensation of hurt. Its memory systems would store and retrieve information about past events without any subjective sense of remembering. The zombie would be functionally identical to a conscious being, but phenomenally absent. All the cognitive machinery running smoothly, but with the lights definitively off inside. This conceivability serves as Chalmers' most powerful intuition pump against reductive physicalism. If we can coherently conceive of such zombies, this suggests something profound about the nature of consciousness itself. Physicalist theories of mind claim that consciousness emerges necessarily from certain physical processes, that once you have the right neural organization, consciousness must follow as inevitably as water flows downhill. But the apparent conceivability of zombies challenges this necessity. If consciousness was simply identical to or logically determined by physical processes, then beings physically identical to us could not possibly lack consciousness. Chalmers frames the challenge starkly for physicalists. If you think that zombies are inconceivable, then you must think that consciousness is logically supervenient on the physical. This creates a crucial burden of proof. Physicalists must explain why zombie scenarios are not merely difficult to imagine, but actually inconceivable. Cried, logically impossible rather than simply nomologically impossible. They must show that consciousness follows from physical organization with the same logical necessity that mathematical truths follow from their premises. The zombie argument gains its precision by distinguishing philosophical zombies from related but different concepts. Chalmers emphasizes that zombies are not behaviorally different from conscious beings. Those would be behavioral zombies, easily dismissed by functionalist theories of mind. Nor are they functionally different in terms of their information processing capabilities. Those would be functional zombies, which many physicalists would readily admit as impossible. Philosophical zombies are identical in all physical, functional, and behavioral respects to conscious beings. They differ only in the presence or absence of subjective, qualitative experience. This distinction makes the zombie argument remarkably targeted. It specifically challenges the logical supervenience of consciousness on the physical. Claim that physical facts logically determine conscious facts with the same necessity that geometric facts determine mathematical facts. The argument does not rely on general anti-materialist intuitions or vague appeals to the mystery of consciousness. The zombie argument achieves its philosophical power through a precise logical structure that transforms intuitive conceivability into rigorous metaphysical reasoning. Chalmers formulates this argument with crystalline clarity. 1. Zombies are conceivable. If zombies are conceivable, zombies are metaphysically possible. San. If zombies are metaphysically possible, then consciousness is not logically supervenient on the physical. Sir. If consciousness is not logically supervenient on the physical, then physicalism is false. Each step follows necessarily from the previous, creating an inference chain that moves from the apparent conceivability of philosophical zombies to the falsity of physicalism itself. This transforms what might seem like mere philosophical speculation into a structured argument with clear logical steps and identifiable premises that physicalists must challenge. The crucial move occurs in the second premise, where conceivability supposedly entails metaphysical possibility. Chalmers develops this inference through his sophisticated two-dimensional semantic framework, distinguishing between different types of conceivability and their epistemic significance. He argues that ideal positive conceivability provides a reliable guide to metaphysical possibility, meaning that when we can conceive of zombies under conditions of ideal rational reflection, with complete information and perfect reasoning, this reveals genuine metaphysical possibility. The principle underlying this inference states, ideal primary positive conceivability entails primary possibility, and primary possibility entails metaphysical possibility. This makes the conceivability-possibility link more rigorous than simple appeals to what we can imagine, grounding it instead in the relationship between rational reflection and modal knowledge. When Chalmers claims that zombies are conceivable, he means something specific and demanding. Primary conceivability involves conceiving of zombies as actual, rather than merely considering them as counterfactual scenarios. Positive conceivability requires that we can positively conceive of zombie worlds, not merely that we cannot derive a contradiction from their description. Ideal conceivability demands that zombie conceivability would survive ideal rational reflection with complete physical knowledge. This analysis suggests that when we conceive of zombies, we're not simply imagining something that seems possible, but recognizing that consciousness is not a priori entailed by physical facts. The conceivability of zombies reveals that no amount of purely physical information logically determines conscious experience. The metaphysical significance of zombie possibility lies in its implications for logical supervenience. Chalmers argues that if zombies are metaphysically possible, then consciousness cannot be logically supervenient on the physical, meaning physical facts don't logically determine conscious facts. He defines logical supervenience precisely. Logical supervenience is the thesis that any two logically possible worlds that are physically identical are also phenomenally identical. Zombie possibility provides a direct counterexample to this thesis by describing possible worlds physically identical to ours, but lacking consciousness entirely. If such worlds are genuinely possible, then physical facts alone cannot account for conscious experience through logical necessity. This creates a crucial distinction between logical and natural supervenience that clarifies what the zombie argument establishes. Chalmers emphasizes that the argument targets logical supervenience rather than natural supervenience, meaning it challenges a priori entailment from physical to phenomenal rather than lawful connection in the actual world. As he clarifies, Even if zombies are possible, consciousness might still be naturally supervenient on the physical, connected by psychophysical laws rather than logical necessity. This allows for a naturalistic approach to consciousness that acknowledges systematic psychophysical connections whilst denying that consciousness reduces to physical processes through conceptual analysis. The zombie argument's sophistication has generated extensive philosophical literature precisely because it makes the theoretical costs of physicalism explicit and unavoidable. The phenomenal concept strategy represents the most sophisticated physicalist response to Chalmers' zombie argument, attempting to preserve materialism by relocating the explanatory gap from metaphysics to concepts themselves. Physicalists like Brian Lower and David Papineau argue that the apparent conceivability of zombies stems from special features of how we conceptualize conscious experience, not from any genuine metaphysical possibility. Their strategy maintains that whilst we possess direct, quotational concepts of our phenomenal states that seem to reveal their essential nature, these concepts create an illusion of metaphysical gaps where none actually exist. Chalmers characterizes this response precisely. The phenomenal concept strategy holds that there is no metaphysical gap between physical and phenomenal properties, but only a conceptual gap that arises from the special nature of phenomenal concepts. The physicalist claims that phenomenal concepts are constituted by the very experiences they represent, giving them a unique epistemic character that makes physical phenomenal identities seem substantive when they are merely conceptual. This response attempts to explain away zombie intuitions, whilst maintaining that consciousness is nothing over and above physical processes. The strategy faces a fundamental challenge through Chalmers' meta-problem of consciousness, which exposes why concept-based replies miss their target. The meta-problem asks why we have the specific intuitions we do about consciousness, why we think there's something it's like to be conscious, why we believe in qualia, why the hard problem seems so compelling. Chalmers argues that the phenomenal concept strategy fails to address the systematic nature of these intuitions and their particular phenomenological character. His analysis reveals the strategy's inadequacy. The phenomenal concept strategy predicts that we should have intuitions of a gap, but it doesn't predict the specific character of these intuitions or explain why they take the form they do. The strategy might explain why we have some sense of mystery about consciousness, but it cannot account for the precise structure of our consciousness-related judgments, why we distinguish between access and phenomenal consciousness, why we have specific intuitions about inverted spectra, or absent qualia, why the hard problem has its particular contours. These systematic features of our consciousness concepts and the meta-problem demonstrates that concept-based strategies remain insufficient to explain the full range of consciousness-related phenomena. Chalmers has refined the zombie argument through increasingly precise distinctions about conceivability to address sophisticated objections. He distinguishes between prima facie and ideal conceivability, a difference between what seems conceivable on first consideration versus what remains conceivable after ideal rational reflection. He separates positive from negative conceivability, actually conceiving of zombies versus merely failing to derive a contradiction from their description. Most crucially, he differentiates primary from secondary conceivability, corresponding to whether zombies are conceivable when terms are understood according to their primary or secondary intentions. These distinctions yield a refined formulation. Zombies are ideally primarily positively conceivable, and ideal primary positive conceivability entails primary possibility. This precision helps the argument survive objections based on the fallibility of conceivability judgments or the semantic complexity of consciousness concepts. The refined argument maintains that even after ideal rational reflection, using concepts in their primary sense, zombies remain positively conceivable, and this conceivability corresponds to genuine metaphysical possibility. The zombie argument's deeper contribution lies not merely in refuting physicalism, but in revealing the fundamental structure of the mind-body problem. Part 3. Property dualism and naturalistic dualism. Chalmers recognizes that consciousness poses a fundamental challenge to physicalism, yet he firmly rejects the traditional Cartesian solution of substance dualism. The problems with this classical approach are profound and well documented. As Chalmers analyses it, the problems with interactionist dualism are well known. The most obvious is the problem of mental causation. How can an immaterial mind affect a physical body? This question strikes at the heart of Cartesian dualism's fatal weakness. Substance dualism posits two entirely distinct kinds of substances, mental and physical, that must somehow interact despite their radically different natures. The mental substance, being immaterial and non-spatial, lacks any clear mechanism for influencing physical processes. Yet, our everyday experience suggests that mental events do cause physical effects. When you decide to raise your hand, that mental decision apparently causes neural firing, muscle contraction, and physical movement. How can something without physical properties exert physical force? This interaction problem becomes even more acute when viewed through the lens of modern science. Chalmers emphasizes the scientific implausibility of substance dualism, given our current understanding of physics and neuroscience. If consciousness exists as an immaterial substance that influences brain processes, it must somehow inject energy into the physical system without any physical source. This violates fundamental principles like conservation of energy whenever mental events produce physical effects. Chalmers captures this difficulty precisely. If consciousness is to have any causal efficacy, and if it is not itself physical, then it seems that physical effects must have non-physical causes, violating the causal closure of the physical. Modern physics describes a world where every physical event has sufficient physical causes. There appears to be no gaps where immaterial influences could enter without disrupting the elegant mathematical structure of physical law. Neuroscience compounds these problems by revealing the intimate dependence of consciousness on brain states. Damage specific neural regions, and you alter or eliminate corresponding aspects of conscious experience. Stimulate the brain electrically, and you can produce vivid, conscious experiences. This tight correlation between brain states and conscious states suggests that consciousness is far more integrated with physical processes than substance dualism can easily accommodate. Rather than abandon the irreducibility of consciousness in the face of these difficulties, Chalmers proposes property dualism as a middle path. This position preserves what's compelling about dualism, whilst avoiding its fatal flaws. As Chalmers explains, property dualism holds that there is one kind of substance in the world, but two kinds of properties, physical properties and phenomenal properties. This elegant solution maintains that conscious beings are unified physical systems possessing both physical and phenomenal properties. Property dualism sidesteps the interaction problem entirely. Since both physical and phenomenal properties belong to the same substance, and greater, the conscious brain, there's no mysterious causal gap to bridge. The brain doesn't need to interact with some separate immaterial realm. It simply instantiates both types of properties simultaneously. When you experience the redness of a rose, that phenomenal property, and the corresponding neural activity are different aspects of the same underlying brain state. This approach aligns with Chalmers' deeper analysis of what physical science actually tells us about reality. Physical properties are fundamentally structural and relational, characterized by their causal roles and mathematical relationships. Mass is defined by how objects accelerate under force, charge by electromagnetic interactions, momentum by resistance to change in motion. But what is the intrinsic nature of the entities that bear these structural properties? Chalmers offers a crucial insight. Physical science tells us about the structural and relational properties of physical processes, but it tells us nothing about their intrinsic nature. Physics describes the behavior of particles and fields with extraordinary precision, yet remains silent about what these entities are like from the inside. Consciousness presents us with a fundamental choice. Either we explain it away through reductive analysis, or we accept it as an irreducible feature of nature itself. Chalmers argues compellingly for the latter path, developing what he terms naturalistic dualism, a position that takes consciousness as fundamental without abandoning scientific naturalism. The logic here follows a clear pattern observed throughout the history of science. When faced with phenomena that resist reduction to more basic features, we eventually recognize them as fundamental aspects of reality. Mass cannot be explained in terms of something more basic. It simply is a fundamental property that grounds physical laws rather than being explained by them. The same holds for electric charge, space-time curvature, and quantum spin. These features form the bedrock upon which scientific explanation rests. Chalmers extends this reasoning to consciousness with characteristic precision. If consciousness cannot be reductively explained, then it must be accepted as fundamental. This is the way it is with fundamental features of the world. They are not explained in terms of more basic features, but are taken as basic themselves. This doesn't render consciousness supernatural or mysterious. It places consciousness alongside mass and charge as irreducible features that ground natural laws rather than being explained by them. This fundamental status opens remarkable possibilities for scientific investigation. Rather than seeking to reduce conscious experience to neural activity, naturalistic dualism points toward discovering psychophysical laws, HCY, systematic connections between physical processes and phenomenal properties. Just as physics discovers laws connecting different physical properties, we need laws connecting brain states to conscious experiences. Chalmers envisions this scientific program with striking clarity. We need psychophysical laws, connecting physical processes to experience. These laws will not interfere with physical laws, but will be additional laws of nature. These psychophysical laws would make consciousness predictable and scientifically investigable without requiring reduction to purely physical processes. The systematic correlations we observe between neural activity and reported experiences suggest such laws already operate, that we simply need to articulate them precisely. Consider how this transforms our approach to consciousness research. Instead of asking how neural firing produces subjective experience, a question that leads to the explanatory gap, we ask, what lawful regularities connect specific types of brain activity to specific types of conscious experience? This shift makes consciousness empirically tractable whilst respecting its irreducible nature. The evidence for such regularities appears compelling. Different types of conscious experience correlate systematically with different patterns of neural activity. Visual experiences correspond to activity in visual cortex, auditory experiences to auditory processing regions, emotional experiences to limbic system activation, These correlations suggest underlying psychophysical laws governing the relationship between physical and phenomenal properties. Chalmers captures this insight precisely. Even if consciousness is not logically supervenient on the physical, it may be naturally supervenient, connected by laws of nature. Natural supervenience means that whilst conscious experiences don't follow necessarily from physical processes, they follow lawfully. Just as electromagnetic phenomena follow lawfully from the distribution of charges and currents without being reducible to them. This naturalistic framework preserves scientific respectability whilst acknowledging consciousness as irreducible. Rather than undermining our scientific worldview, naturalistic dualism enriches it by recognizing aspects of reality that purely physical theories inevitably miss. As Chalmers puts it, a naturalistic dualism expands our ontology slightly. We have to take experience as fundamental, but it does not require us to give up our naturalistic worldview. The expansion proves minimal, yet profound. We add conscious experience to our fundamental ontology alongside mass, charge, and space-time. Then investigate the laws governing its relationship to physical processes. David Chalmers' most profound insight into consciousness lies in what he calls the principle of structural coherence, the recognition that, whilst conscious experience possesses irreducible qualitative properties, it exhibits systematic organization that mirrors the structure of underlying cognitive processes. As Chalmers formulates it, this is the principle that consciousness has a coherent structure that mirrors the structure of cognition. This principle provides a crucial bridge between the subjective and objective domains, without collapsing one into the other. Rather than viewing consciousness as structurally arbitrary or completely disconnected from physical processes, Chalmers demonstrates that conscious experiences exhibit lawful relationships that correspond systematically to the organization of neural activity. The manifestation of structural coherence becomes apparent when examining specific aspects of conscious experience and their neural correlates. Chalmers' analysis of visual consciousness reveals how the spatial organization of visual experience, with its color relationships, depth perception, and attentional focus, systematically mirrors the structure of visual processing in the brain. The correspondence extends beyond mere correlation to systematic structural preservation. As Chalmers observes, when we attend to something, we are conscious of it. When we categorize something, we are conscious of it as falling under that category. These systematic correspondences suggest that psychophysical laws preserve structural relationships whilst connecting categorically different types of properties, the phenomenal and the physical. The foundation for such psychophysical laws emerges through understanding how relational properties of experience correspond to relational properties of physical processes. Chalmers argues that whilst the intrinsic qualitative nature of experience remains irreducible to physical description, its relational structure can be systematically connected to physical structure. Experiences stand in similarity and difference relations that mirror the similarity and difference relations among neural states. A red experience differs from a blue experience in ways that correspond to how red processing neural states differ from blue processing neural states. As Chalmers puts it, the structural properties of experience are precisely those that can be captured in a relational characterization. This creates the possibility of systematic psychophysical laws that govern the relationship between consciousness and physical processes. This structural approach enables scientific investigation of consciousness despite its irreducible nature. Chalmers demonstrates that by focusing on structural properties, we can study consciousness objectively without solving the hard problem of reducing qualitative experience to physical processes. The methodology becomes clear in his observation. By concentrating on the structural properties of experience, we can make progress on understanding consciousness without solving the hard problem. Neuroscience can map the structure of consciousness systematically, identifying which neural processes correlate with which aspects of experience, understanding how changes in brain structure alter the structure of consciousness, and discovering the principles that govern these relationships. Yet structural coherence raises profound questions about the scope of consciousness in nature. If consciousness follows natural laws that connect it systematically to structural organization, where else might consciousness be found? The systematic relationship between structure and experience suggests that consciousness might not be limited to human brains, but could extend to other organized systems that exhibit appropriate structural complexity. This possibility opens toward exploring whether consciousness might be a fundamental feature of nature itself, present wherever there is sufficient structural organization, and raises the deep question of how micro-level conscious properties might combine into the rich, macro-level conscious experiences we know intimately. Part theory, Panpsychist possibilities. Simple property dualism faces a fundamental challenge that pushes philosophical inquiry toward more radical conclusions. Chalmers recognizes that if consciousness is truly irreducible to physical processes, yet emerges only at certain levels of complexity, we confront a puzzling question. Why does it emerge precisely there rather than elsewhere? This isn't merely about identifying the neural correlates of consciousness, but about explaining the very possibility of emergence itself. As Chalmers formulates the dilemma, if consciousness is fundamental, why does it emerge only in certain complex systems? And if it's not fundamental, how can it emerge from non-conscious components? This question reveals a deep tension. Either consciousness can somehow arise from purely non-conscious components, which seems to violate the irreducibility thesis, or it must be present in some form throughout nature. The emergence problem motivates panpsychism as a philosophical alternative that avoids the mysterious leap from non-conscious to conscious by making consciousness go all the way down. Chalmers presents panpsychism as the view that consciousness is a fundamental feature of the world, existing at the microphysical level. Rather than treating consciousness as something that appears only in complex biological systems, panpsychism suggests it's a basic feature of reality itself. As Chalmers explains, if consciousness is fundamental, then we might expect it to be widespread. Perhaps all physical entities have associated phenomenal properties. This radical move eliminates the emergence problem entirely by making consciousness as fundamental as mass or charge, distributed throughout the physical world rather than confined to brains and nervous systems. Yet panpsychism immediately confronts what may be an even more challenging puzzle: the combination problem. Chalmers identifies this as potentially the hardest obstacle facing panpsychist theories. The question becomes, how do micro-experiences combine to yield macro-experiences? Why is there a unified conscious field rather than just a collection of separate micro-experiences? This isn't simply about aggregation in the way that micromasses combine to create macromass through straightforward addition. The combination problem concerns how separate conscious subjects could literally combine into a single, unified conscious subject. How the scattered micro-experiences of electrons and quarks could somehow merge into the unified conscious field of human experience. The challenge runs deeper than it initially appears, because consciousness seems to require genuine unity rather than mere collection. Chalmers observes that physical combination is relatively straightforward, but phenomenal combination is deeply mysterious. Physical properties combine through aggregation or averaging, masses add up, charges cancel or reinforce, temperatures equilibrate. But consciousness presents a fundamentally different challenge: the unity of consciousness. AS, the fact that we experience single, integrated conscious fields rather than collections of separate experiences, makes combination much more problematic than standard physical processes. When you experience the taste of coffee whilst hearing music, these aren't separate experiences that happen to occur simultaneously. They're unified within a single conscious field. How could the micro-experiences of countless particles achieve this kind of genuine unity? The combination problem doesn't necessarily refute panpsychism, but it does reveal the depth of the challenge facing any theory that distributes consciousness throughout nature. Different varieties of panpsychism attempt to solve or avoid this problem through different assumptions about the nature and distribution of consciousness. Some propose that only certain kinds of physical systems can support the right kind of combination. Others suggest that the boundaries between conscious subjects are less clear-cut than we typically assume. The problem motivates exploring not just whether consciousness goes all the way down, but how it might be organized and unified across different scales of reality. These questions push us toward examining the very nature of conscious unity and the boundaries that define minded systems within the broader conscious universe that panpsychism envisions. Micropsychism represents the most straightforward interpretation of panpsychist theory, placing consciousness directly at the foundation of physical reality. Chalmers characterizes this position clearly. Micropsychism holds that microphysical entities such as electrons and quarks have conscious experiences. This approach takes seriously the idea that if consciousness is to be fundamental rather than emergent, it must exist at the level of basic physical entities themselves. The electron spinning in its orbital possesses some form of conscious experience, however simple or alien to our own. The quark bound within a proton has its own subjective perspective on reality. The appeal of micropsychism lies in its direct solution to the emergence problem that haunts physicalist theories. Rather than requiring consciousness to somehow arise from purely unconscious matter through complex organization, micropsychism ensures consciousness is present from the very beginning. Complex conscious systems like human brains become combinations of already conscious components, avoiding the mysterious leap from unconscious to conscious that physicalism cannot explain. The brain's unified conscious experience emerges through the combination and integration of countless micro-conscious experiences, each contributing its perspective to the larger conscious whole. Yet micropsychism faces a formidable challenge in determining which systems possess unified consciousness. Chalmers identifies this boundary problem with characteristic precision. If micropsychism is true, then presumably some macro entities have unified conscious experiences and others do not. But what determines the boundaries? If electrons are conscious and human brains are conscious, what about the intermediate cases? Does a rock possess unified conscious experience through the combination of its constituent particles' consciousness? What about a plant, an ecosystem, or a galaxy? The theory threatens to populate the universe with conscious entities in ways that strain our intuitions about the distribution of consciousness. This boundary problem reveals the need for principled criteria to distinguish systems with unified consciousness from mere aggregates of separate conscious entities. Without such principles, micropsychism risks either denying consciousness to systems that intuitively possess it, or attributing consciousness to systems where it seems implausible. The challenge becomes developing combination laws that explain how micro-conscious experiences unite into macro-conscious experiences, whilst avoiding counterintuitive implications about conscious rocks or conscious thermostats. Cosmopsychism offers a radically different approach that sidesteps these boundary problems by reversing the direction of explanation entirely. Rather than building up consciousness from microcomponents, cosmopsychism begins with the cosmos itself. As the primary conscious entity, Chalmers presents this view as holding that the cosmos as a whole is conscious, and smaller conscious entities are aspects of cosmic consciousness. The universe possesses a unified conscious experience, and individual conscious beings like ourselves represent localized aspects or perspectives within this cosmic consciousness. This approach elegantly avoids the combination problem by starting with unified consciousness rather than trying to construct it. As Chalmers analyzes, instead of building up consciousness from micro-components, cosmopsychism starts with macro-consciousness and derives micro-consciousness through decomposition. The question becomes not how separate conscious entities combine into unified wholes, but rather how the cosmic conscious experience differentiates into distinct conscious perspectives. Our individual consciousness represents a localized manifestation of the universe's own conscious experience, much as a wave represents a localized manifestation of the ocean's movement. Cosmopsychism transforms our understanding of personal identity and the relationship between individual and universal consciousness. We are not separate conscious beings struggling to understand our place in an unconscious universe, but rather expressions of the universe's own self-awareness. Integrated information theory emerges as perhaps the most promising mathematical framework for determining conscious boundaries within panpsychist theories. David Chalmers recognizes IIT's revolutionary potential in his analysis. According to IIT, a system is conscious if and only if it has integrated information above a certain threshold. Giulio Tononi's phi measure quantifies precisely how much information a system generates that remains both differentiated and integrated. Differentiated, because the system can exist in many distinct states. Integrated, because the states of its parts demonstrate genuine interdependence rather than mere aggregation. This mathematical precision addresses panpsychism's most persistent challenge, the boundary problem, where traditional panpsychist theories struggle to explain which collections of micro-conscious entities form unified macro-conscious systems. IIT provides objective criteria. Systems with sufficient information integration achieve consciousness not through mysterious emergence, but through measurable informational relationships. The theory transforms consciousness from an inexplicable property into a quantifiable phenomenon, making panpsychist claims scientifically tractable. Chalmers emphasizes how IIT supports panpsychist conclusions about consciousness being widespread throughout nature. If IIT is correct, then consciousness is much more widespread than we typically assume. Tononi himself acknowledges that his theory implies consciousness exists in many systems we ordinarily consider unconscious, simple networks, individual neurons, perhaps even basic information processing structures. This aligns remarkably with panpsychist intuitions, whilst providing principled criteria for determining degrees and boundaries of consciousness across natural systems. The theory addresses the combination problem through a sophisticated understanding of information integration. Rather than requiring micro-experiences to literally combine a conceptually problematic notion, IIT explains how systems with integrated information possess unified conscious experiences. As Chalmers notes, the theory's approach suggests that consciousness corresponds to integrated information generated by a system, not to the sum of consciousness in its parts. This transforms the combination problem from an unsolvable puzzle into an empirical question about informational relationships. IIT's implications extend powerfully into machine consciousness and technological contexts. Chalmers analyzes how the theory suggests appropriately organized artificial systems could achieve consciousness through sufficient information integration. His observation proves crucial. If IIT is correct, then consciousness depends on information integration, not on biological implementation. This supports the genuine possibility of conscious artificial intelligence, whilst providing concrete criteria for determining when artificial systems achieve consciousness, making previously speculative questions empirically tractable. These developments in panpsychist theory through IIT raise fundamental questions about consciousness's relationship to intentionality and mental content. If consciousness proves fundamental and widespread, this transforms traditional approaches in philosophy of mind that typically begin with representation and attempt to explain consciousness in representational terms. The possibility emerges that consciousness might ground mental content and representation, rather than being grounded by them, a revolutionary inversion demanding careful examination. Part 5. Foundations of Philosophy of Mind. Mental states possess a remarkable property that distinguishes them from mere physical events. They exhibit intentionality, the capacity to be about or directed toward objects and properties beyond themselves. When you believe that Paris is beautiful, desire a cup of coffee, or perceive a red rose, your mental state reaches beyond the confines of your skull to refer to something else in the world. As Chalmers observes, mental states have intentional content. They are about things in the world. This aboutness creates one of the most perplexing puzzles in philosophy of mind. How can physical states in the brain possess this seemingly magical property of reference? The traditional approach in philosophy of mind attempts to solve this puzzle by explaining consciousness in terms of intentional content. According to this strategy, conscious experiences are simply mental states that represent the world in particular ways. Your experience of redness, for instance, is nothing over and above your brain's representation of certain wavelengths of light. This representationalist program promises to naturalize consciousness by reducing it to the more tractable notion of mental representation, which can then be explained in terms of causal relations or functional roles. Chalmers fundamentally reverses this explanatory strategy. Rather than explaining consciousness in terms of intentionality, he argues that conscious experience is more fundamental than intentional content. This inversion transforms our understanding of the relationship between mind and world. Phenomenal properties, the intrinsic qualitative features of conscious experience, don't depend on external relations for their existence. The redness you experience when looking at a rose possesses its qualitative character independently of whether that experience successfully refers to actual red objects in the world. Intentional properties, by contrast, are inherently relational, depending on connections between mental states and external circumstances. This consciousness-first approach suggests that conscious experience grounds intentional content through the direct acquaintance we have with our own mental states. When you form thoughts about redness, your concept of red gains its content partly through your conscious experience of redness itself, not merely through causal or functional relations to red objects. As Chalmers puts it, phenomenal concepts involve a direct acquaintance with the properties they refer to. This direct acquaintance provides a foundation for mental content that purely externalist or functionalist theories cannot capture. The implications of making consciousness foundational extend throughout philosophy of mind. If conscious experience grounds intentionality rather than the reverse, then any complete theory of mental content must take phenomenal properties seriously, rather than attempting to reduce them to causal relations or functional roles. Chalmers emphasizes that a theory of content that ignores consciousness will be incomplete at best. This challenges both externalist theories that locate content in environmental relations and functionalist theories that locate content in causal structures, suggesting that the qualitative dimension of experience plays an irreducible role in determining what our mental states are about. This consciousness-first approach creates a fundamental tension with representationalist theories of mind, which attempt to explain away conscious experience by reducing it to representational content. If Chalmers is correct, that consciousness grounds representation rather than the reverse, then representationalism gets the explanatory direction backwards. The relationship between consciousness and representation emerges as one of the deepest issues in philosophy of mind, with profound implications for understanding how mental states relate to the external world, and whether conscious experience can be naturalized within a purely physical worldview. The representational theory of mind stands as the dominant approach in contemporary philosophy of mind, offering what appears to be an elegant solution to the puzzle of mental content. According to representationalism, mental states are fundamentally representational states, and their phenomenal character, if any. This theory attempts to unify the mental realm by treating both beliefs and experiences as different types of representations, with consciousness emerging from or being identical to certain types of representational content. The appeal of this approach lies in its promise of theoretical unity. Rather than treating thoughts and experiences as fundamentally different kinds of mental phenomena, representationalism suggests they share a common structure. Both your belief that snow is white and your visual experience of white snow involve representations, mental states that point beyond themselves to features of the world. The theory proposes that what we call consciousness arises when these representational states take on particular properties or reach certain levels of complexity. Strong representationalism goes further, attempting to reduce consciousness entirely to representational content. The view holds that phenomenal properties are identical to certain representational properties. Michael Tai and other proponents argue that conscious experiences are representations of external properties. The redness of a red experience just is the representation of red surfaces in the environment. When you see a red rose, qualitative redness you experience isn't some additional property over and above your mental representation of the rose's color. It simply is that representation. This approach promises to solve the hard problem by making consciousness a matter of representing rather than something mysterious that exists over and above representation. If phenomenal properties are identical to representational properties, then explaining consciousness becomes a matter of explaining how mental states acquire representational content, a task that seems more tractable than explaining how physical processes give rise to subjective experience. Yet Chalmers identifies a fundamental flaw in this representationalist program. Even if conscious states have representational content, there is something about conscious experience, its qualitative, subjective character, that goes beyond any representational content. The problem isn't that conscious states lack representational content, but that they possess something additional that cannot be captured by their representational properties alone. Consider Chalmers' analysis of inverted spectrum scenarios. Two individuals might have systematically inverted color experiences whilst maintaining identical representational content, MBT, both correctly identify ripe tomatoes as red and represent the same environmental properties. Yet their phenomenal experiences differ qualitatively. This suggests that consciousness involves intrinsic, qualitative properties that cannot be captured by representational relations alone. The what-it's-like aspect of experience seems to float free of representational content. The deeper issue concerns the nature of representational and phenomenal properties themselves. Representational properties are essentially relational, encation. They depend on connections between mental states and external objects or properties. A mental state represents red by standing in the right, causal or informational relations to red objects in the environment. Phenomenal properties, however, seem intrinsic to experience itself. As Chalmers argues, representational properties are extrinsic, but phenomenal properties are intrinsic. This creates a fundamental mismatch that prevents the reduction of consciousness to representation. Relational properties cannot be identical to intrinsic properties. The redness of your visual experience has an intrinsic qualitative nature that exists independently of its representational connections to red objects. Even if we could specify all the representational properties of a conscious state, we would still face the question of why there is something it is like to be in that state. The failure of representationalism reveals something crucial about the structure of mind. Rather than reducing consciousness to representation or representation to consciousness, we need frameworks that can accommodate both aspects of mental life. The relationship between conscious experience and cognitive processing stands as one of the most formidable challenges confronting any comprehensive theory of mind. David Chalmers has articulated this challenge with characteristic precision. How does consciousness relate to cognition? Does consciousness play a causal role in cognitive processing? Or is it merely an epiphenomenal byproduct? This question strikes at the heart of whether consciousness genuinely matters for how minds operate, or whether it simply accompanies cognitive mechanisms whilst they perform all the substantive work of mental life. The stakes could hardly be higher. If consciousness proves epiphenomenal, a mere shadow cast by cognitive processes, then our most intimate sense of agency and mental causation becomes illusory. Every decision we believe we consciously make, every problem we think we consciously solve, would represent nothing more than the brain's cognitive machinery operating whilst consciousness passively observes. Yet, Chalmers challenges both eliminativist dismissals of consciousness and epiphenomenalist relegations of it to causal irrelevance. Consciousness exhibits systematic relationships with cognitive processes that strongly suggest genuine causal efficacy. Chalmers observes that conscious states seem to make a difference to behavior in systematic ways. Consider how conscious attention dramatically affects information processing. ID. Attended stimuli receive enhanced processing whilst unattended information often fails to reach awareness. Conscious decisions influence subsequent actions in ways that mere unconscious processing cannot fully explain. Conscious experiences provide information that affects later cognitive processes, enabling reflection, planning, and behavioral modification based on phenomenal content. These systematic relationships suggest that consciousness isn't merely riding along whilst cognition does the real work. Instead, conscious properties might make genuine causal differences through their systematic connections to physical properties. Chalmers proposes that even if consciousness involves irreducible phenomenal properties, these properties might be systematically connected to physical properties through psychophysical laws in ways that grant them causal relevance. As he explains, phenomenal properties might be causally relevant not by violating physical laws, but by being systematically connected to physical properties that are causally relevant. This insight preserves both consciousness's irreducible nature and its causal efficacy. Rather than reducing consciousness to purely physical processes or banishing it to epiphenomenal irrelevance, Chalmers envisions psychophysical laws that bridge the explanatory gap without collapsing the distinction. Just as physical laws systematically connect different physical properties, NBA, mass to gravitational effects, charge to electromagnetic forces, psychophysical laws might connect conscious experiences to cognitive processes in ways that make phenomenal properties cognitively relevant. Chalmers articulates this vision. These laws would not reduce consciousness to cognition, but would establish systematic relationships that make consciousness cognitively relevant. Such laws would explain why particular conscious experiences correlate with specific cognitive processes, why attention affects information processing, and why conscious reflection influences decision-making. Consciousness would influence cognition, not by violating physical causal closure, but through systematic psychophysical connections that make phenomenal properties difference-makers in cognitive processing. This framework transforms our understanding of mental causation. Rather than consciousness competing with physical causation or being eliminated by it, conscious properties work through their systematic relationships with physical properties. The irreducible nature of phenomenal experience doesn't render it causally impotent. Instead, psychophysical laws ensure that consciousness makes systematic differences to cognitive processing whilst respecting physical causal closure. Yet this relationship between consciousness and cognition raises deeper questions about the boundaries and determinants of mental content itself. If conscious experiences influence cognitive processing through systematic psychophysical connections, what determines the content of both consciousness and cognition? Part 6. Content, Externalism, and Twin Earth. Hilary Putnam's Twin Earth thought experiment stands as one of the most revolutionary challenges to traditional assumptions about mental content in 20th century philosophy of mind. Chalmers presents the scenario with characteristic precision. Twin Earth is just like Earth, except that the stuff that fills the oceans and lakes that we call water has a different chemical composition. Not H2O, but some other chemical, XYZ. This deceptively simple setup creates a philosophical earthquake. Twin Earth inhabitants are molecule for molecule identical to their Earth counterparts, sharing identical brain states, identical experiences, identical linguistic practices. Yet they inhabit an environment where the clear, drinkable liquid that sustains life possesses a fundamentally different chemical structure. The genius of Putnam's construction lies in its ability to isolate environmental factors whilst holding psychological factors constant. When Twin Earth inhabitants look at their lakes and rivers, they experience exactly what Earth inhabitants experience when looking at H2O. The liquids taste identical, feel identical, support life identically. No amount of ordinary observation or experience could reveal the molecular difference between H2O and XYZ. This creates the perfect philosophical laboratory for examining whether mental content depends solely on internal brain states or whether environmental factors play a constitutive role. Putnam's argument strikes at the heart of internalist assumptions about mental content. When an Earth inhabitant thinks, water is wet, Chalmers explains, I'm thinking about H2O. When my twin thinks, water is wet, he's thinking about XYZ. Despite possessing identical brain states and identical conscious experiences, These thoughts possess different contents because they refer to different chemical substances. This leads to Putnam's famous conclusion that meanings just ain't in the head. The content of our water thoughts cannot be determined by examining our brains alone, no matter how thoroughly we map neural activity or analyze psychological processes. The philosophical implications prove profound. Chalmers emphasizes that the difference between H2O and XYZ makes a difference to mental content, even though it makes no difference to psychology. This reveals that mental content reaches beyond individual psychology to depend on environmental factors that may remain completely unknown to the thinker. An Earth inhabitant and their twin Earth counterpart could live their entire lives without discovering the molecular difference between their respective liquids, yet this difference constitutes a real difference in what their thoughts refer to when they think about water. This externalist conclusion fundamentally challenges individualistic approaches to mental states. Chalmers characterizes externalism as the thesis that mental content is not solely determined by intrinsic properties of the individual, but depends partly on the individual's environment. Traditional psychology assumes that mental states can be fully characterized by examining individuals in isolation from their environmental context. Twin Earth scenarios demonstrate that this assumption fails for mental content. To understand what someone is thinking about when they think about water, we must know not just their brain state, but also which chemical substance they're causally connected to in their environment. The Twin Earth argument creates a fundamental tension in our understanding of mental states. If mental content depends on environmental factors beyond individual psychology, how do we preserve the explanatory power of psychology as a science of individual minds? This tension demands careful examination of whether we can distinguish between different aspects of mental states, perhaps separating narrow psychological content from wide environmental content, or whether we must fundamentally reconceptualize the relationship between mind and world. The externalist revolution in philosophy of mind presents a fundamental challenge to our understanding of mental content and psychological explanation. David Chalmers identifies the core problem with characteristic precision. If mental content depends on environment, then psychology cannot be a science of individuals considered in isolation from their environment. This challenge strikes at the heart of psychology's scientific aspirations, threatening to make psychological explanation dependent on vast environmental factors that may be entirely unknown to both the experiencing subject and the investigating psychologist. The twin Earth scenarios that motivate externalism suggest that mental states extend beyond individual brains in ways that complicate psychological theorizing. When we consider psychological twins, CR molecule for molecule duplicates in different environments. CR externalism implies they possess different mental contents, despite their identical internal states. This environmental dependence of content threatens psychology's autonomy as a science, potentially requiring psychological explanations to encompass not just neural processes, but entire environmental histories and contexts. Yet, this externalist insight generates a powerful internalist response, one that Chalmers articulates with equal force. There must be some notion of mental content that captures what psychological twins genuinely share, something that remains in the head and available for psychological explanation. As Chalmers puts the internalist concern, surely there is something that my twin and I share psychologically, something that explains our similar behavior and cognitive processes. The internalist intuition insists that psychology cannot lose its subject matter to environmental factors beyond the individual's psychological boundaries. This tension between externalist insights and internalist intuitions motivates Chalmers' analysis of narrow content as a potential solution. He defines narrow content as that aspect of mental content that is determined by intrinsic properties of the individual. Narrow content represents the attempt to preserve what remains psychologically relevant, whilst acknowledging externalism's environmental insights. Rather than rejecting externalism, narrow content seeks to accommodate it by identifying the internal psychological reality that psychological twins genuinely share. Chalmers characterizes narrow content as potentially functioning as a mapping from environments to wide contents. This functional characterization preserves internalist insights by locating something determinate within individual psychology, whilst respecting externalist observations about environmental dependence. The narrow content shared by psychological twins would be their identical capacity to generate specific wide contents when placed in particular environments. This analysis suggests a division of explanatory labor between narrow and wide content that serves different theoretical purposes. Chalmers explores how narrow content might be relevant for psychological explanation and behavioral prediction, capturing the internal mechanisms that drive cognitive processes and behavioral responses. Wide content, by contrast, would remain relevant for determining truth conditions and referential relations, the semantic properties that connect mental states to environmental objects and states of affairs. Narrow content might explain behavior, while wide content determines truth and reference, Chalmers observes, articulating a potential reconciliation between competing theoretical demands. This division attempts to preserve both internalist and externalist insights by assigning them to different aspects of mental content with distinct explanatory roles. Psychology could maintain its focus on narrow content as the proper domain of psychological explanation, while semantics and philosophy of language could address wide content's environmental dependencies. Yet this neat division raises deeper questions about the relationship between consciousness, content, and environment that challenge traditional assumptions about the boundaries of mind. If narrow content captures what's psychologically real and explanatorily relevant, what does this mean for conscious experience itself? The question of whether conscious experience itself can be environmentally dependent pushes externalism into its most radical territory, extending beyond propositional attitudes to the very fabric of subjective experience. Chalmers formulates this challenge with characteristic precision. Phenomenal externalism is the thesis that the phenomenal content of experience is not determined by intrinsic properties of the experiencing subject. This represents something far more provocative than standard content externalism, since it suggests that the qualitative, subjective aspects of experience, success, what it's like to have experiences, might depend on environmental factors rather than being intrinsic to consciousness itself. The implications become vivid when we construct twin Earth cases specifically for phenomenal properties. Chalmers probes whether XYZ water would taste different from H2O water to phenomenally identical subjects, asking, does the difference between H2O and XYZ make a phenomenal difference? Does XYZ water taste different from H2O water? This question cuts to the heart of whether the qualitative character of taste experiences depends on the actual chemical composition of what we're tasting, or only on the internal effects on our sensory systems. If phenomenal externalism holds, then the very taste quality, eine, that distinctive, refreshing sensation, might be different on twin Earth, even though the internal neural processes remain identical. Yet phenomenal externalism faces a deeper tension than its content-based cousin. Conscious experience seems to possess an intrinsic qualitative character that doesn't depend on external relations. Chalmers acknowledges this challenge directly. Phenomenal properties seem to be intrinsic properties of experience, not relational properties that depend on the environment. The redness of red, the painfulness of pain, the taste of coffee. These seem to be features that exist in the immediate fabric of consciousness itself, not in virtue of any external relationships. This creates a more profound resistance to externalist treatment than beliefs or desires, which more readily admit of relational analysis. The path forward requires connecting phenomenal character to representational content. Chalmers explores how phenomenal externalism might work through the representational dimension of experience. If phenomenal character is determined by representational content, and representational content is externally determined, then phenomenal character might be externally determined. This suggests that conscious experiences might have their qualitative character precisely because they represent environmental properties in particular ways. The taste of water might be the qualitative way that H2O is represented to consciousness, making the chemical composition partially constitutive of the phenomenal experience itself. This representational approach links phenomenal externalism to broader theories of consciousness that treat subjective experience as fundamentally representational. If consciousness is essentially about representing the world to a subject, and representation involves external relations, then even the most intimate aspects of subjective experience might depend on environmental factors. The boundaries between inner experience and outer world begin to blur in ways that challenge our most basic intuitions about the privacy and intrinsic nature of consciousness. These questions about the environmental dependence of mental content and conscious experience naturally raise even more fundamental issues about the boundaries of mind itself. If what we think and possibly even what we experience can depend on environmental factors, this suggests that minds might not be neatly contained within individual brains. The stage is set for examining whether cognitive processes themselves might extend beyond the biological boundaries of individual subjects into the surrounding environment, challenging our most basic assumptions about where minds stop and the external world begins. Part 7. The Extended Mind. Where does the mind stop and the rest of the world begin? This question, posed by David Chalmers and Andy Clark in their groundbreaking paper, seems deceptively simple. Yet it strikes at one of our most fundamental assumptions about the nature of mind itself. We naturally assume that minds are housed within the biological boundaries of brains and bodies, that cognition happens inside our skulls, whilst the external world remains merely a stage for mental activity. But this assumption becomes increasingly problematic in an age of smartphones, GPS systems, and digital tools that don't merely assist our thinking but seem to augment our cognitive capacities in unprecedented ways. Consider Otto, who suffers from Alzheimer's disease and carries a notebook that plays the role usually played by biological memory. When Otto hears about a museum exhibition, he looks up the address in his notebook, just as his friend Inga recalls the same address from her biological memory. Both access stored information. Both are guided by that information in their subsequent behavior. Both rely on their respective systems automatically and without conscious effort. Otto's notebook functions exactly like Inga's brain-based memory system, serving as a reliable repository of information that shapes his actions and decisions. The parity principle emerges as Chalmers' core argument for extended cognition. If, as we confront some task, a part of the world functions as a process which, were it done in the head, we would have no hesitation in recognizing as part of the cognitive process, then that part of the world is part of the cognitive process. This principle shifts our focus from spatial location to functional role, challenging the assumption that cognition must occur within biological boundaries. Otto's notebook doesn't merely assist his memory. It constitutes his memory system in the same fundamental way that Inga's neural networks constitute hers. Our resistance to this conclusion reveals what Chalmers calls cognitive chauvinism, an unjustified bias toward biological processes that blinds us to functionally equivalent external systems. The boundaries of cognition are not fixed by the boundaries of the body, or even the boundaries of the brain. This insight opens revolutionary possibilities for understanding cognitive enhancement, disability, and the evolving relationship between minds and technology. When Otto writes in his notebook, he's not recording thoughts for later retrieval. He's thinking with and through the notebook itself. Yet the extended mind thesis doesn't collapse into the absurd claim that all tool use constitutes cognitive extension. Not every external aid becomes part of our mental apparatus. The challenge lies in identifying what distinguishes genuine cognitive extension from mere tool use. What criteria must be met for external processes to become authentically cognitive rather than simply instrumental? David Chalmers recognized that not every interaction with external tools constitutes genuine cognitive extension. The extended mind thesis requires specific criteria that distinguish authentic cognitive processes from mere tool use. These criteria emerge from careful analysis of what makes biological cognitive processes genuinely cognitive rather than simply instrumental. Constant access forms the foundational requirement for cognitive extension. The information in Otto's notebook is constantly accessible to him. It's not stored away in a filing cabinet, but carried with him wherever he goes. This constant accessibility mirrors the fundamental nature of biological memory. 17. We don't need to travel to a special location or perform complex procedures to access our stored memories. They remain available whenever cognitive demands arise. The notebook achieves this same accessibility through Otto's consistent practice of carrying it with him. Without constant access, external information remains merely external. CD, a resource we might consult rather than a genuine extension of our cognitive apparatus. Automatic endorsement provides the second crucial criterion that transforms external information into cognitive content. Otto automatically endorses the information in his notebook without subjecting it to the same scrutiny he would apply to information from other sources. Otto doesn't question the information in his notebook any more than Inga questions her biological memories. This automatic trust reveals the deep integration between Otto and his notebook. When we access biological memories, we don't typically pause to verify their accuracy or question their reliability. They feel like direct expressions of our cognitive states. Otto's relationship with his notebook achieves this same automatic endorsement, treating the written information as immediately credible, rather than as claims requiring verification. Easy retrieval completes the trilogy of criteria that makes external processes genuinely cognitive. The information is easily retrievable when needed, without requiring complex inference or interpretation. Accessing Otto's notebook involves the same natural, effortless process as accessing biological memory. He doesn't need to decode complex symbols, perform elaborate searches, or engage in conscious reasoning to extract relevant information. The retrieval process becomes as automatic and immediate as recalling where we left our keys or remembering a friend's birthday. This ease of retrieval transforms the notebook from an external tool into a seamless extension of Otto's cognitive system. Modern technology increasingly satisfies these conditions for cognitive extension in ways that would have seemed impossible when Chalmers first articulated the extended mind thesis. For many of us, our smartphones are constantly accessible, automatically endorsed, and easily retrievable sources of information. GPS navigation systems provide spatial knowledge that we access without conscious effort, automatically trust without verification, and retrieve as easily as biological spatial memory. Contact lists extend our capacity to maintain social connections. Beyond the limits of biological memory, search engines become extensions of our knowledge-seeking processes when they're sufficiently integrated into our cognitive routines. Yet smartphones also reveal the complexity of determining genuine cognitive extension. The same device might function as extended cognition in some contexts, whilst remaining merely instrumental in others. When we automatically reach for our phone to check the time, access a contact, or navigate to a familiar destination, the device might genuinely extend our cognitive processes. When we consciously decide to research an unfamiliar topic, the phone might remain an external tool rather than a cognitive extension. These criteria for cognitive extension establish the groundwork for a more challenging question that pushes beyond the boundaries of information processing and memory storage. If cognitive processes can extend beyond biological boundaries when they meet specific criteria, what about consciousness itself? The extended mind thesis focuses primarily on cognitive functions, AGS, memory, belief formation, reasoning processes. But consciousness involves subjective experience, phenomenal awareness, the felt quality of mental states. Can the criteria that govern cognitive extension also apply to the extension of consciousness beyond the biological boundaries of the brain? Extended consciousness presents a far more challenging case than extended cognition, pushing the boundaries of what we consider the experiencing self. Where extended cognition focuses on information processing and functional roles that can clearly occur in external systems, extended consciousness concerns the qualitative, subjective aspects of experience itself. Chalmers formulates this distinction precisely. Extended consciousness would involve conscious experiences that are partly constituted by processes outside the biological boundaries of the subject. This isn't merely about technological augmentation of our mental capacities, but about whether what it's like to have experiences can literally extend into external technological systems. The challenge becomes apparent when we consider the fundamental difference between cognitive content and conscious experience. Cognitive extension might be relatively straightforward because cognition involves information, processing, storage, and retrieval, functions that external devices can clearly perform. But consciousness involves subjective experience, the felt quality of mental states that seems essentially tied to experiencing subjects. As Chalmers observes, consciousness seems more intimately connected to the experiencing subject than cognition. This creates special philosophical challenges that don't arise for extended cognition, forcing us to question whether phenomenal experience can genuinely transcend the biological boundaries we typically associate with conscious subjects. Consider how extended consciousness might work through sensory substitution and brain-computer interfaces that become integrated parts of the conscious system. Sensory substitution devices convert visual information to tactile patterns, allowing blind users to see through touch. Initially, users consciously interpret these patterns, but with extended use, the device becomes transparent. Users report directly experiencing spatial relationships rather than consciously translating tactile signals. Chalmers explores whether this integration might represent genuine extension. When sensory substitution devices become sufficiently integrated, the conscious experience might literally extend to include processes in the device. The device doesn't merely provide information. It becomes part of the experiential apparatus itself. Brain-computer interfaces that provide direct neural feedback create even stronger cases for extended conscious experience. When neural implants allow direct control of external devices with accompanying sensory feedback, the boundary between internal experience and external technology becomes increasingly unclear. Users report feeling sensations through robotic limbs or experiencing spatial awareness through technological sensors, as if these were natural parts of their conscious experience. The technological components don't simply augment consciousness. They become integrated into the very fabric of subjective experience. These possibilities carry profound implications for personal identity and the boundaries of the self. If conscious experience can extend beyond biological boundaries, traditional assumptions about where persons begin and end require fundamental revision. Chalmers recognizes this challenge. Extended consciousness would imply that the boundaries of the self are not fixed by the boundaries of the body. Our sense of personal identity, typically anchored in our embodied experience, might literally extend into our technological tools and environments. This extension of selfhood raises questions about continuity of identity across technological changes. If part of my conscious experience occurs in external devices, what happens to my identity when those devices are modified, replaced, or removed? The extended self becomes technologically dependent in ways that challenge traditional notions of personal autonomy and psychological continuity. We might find ourselves distributed across multiple technological systems, with conscious experience spanning biological and artificial boundaries. Such questions reveal the need for precise conceptual analysis to navigate these emerging realities. The debates about extended mind and consciousness expose fundamental uncertainties about our concepts of mind, consciousness, and personal identity. Part 8. Two-dimensional semantics. Saul Kripke revealed a puzzle that shook the foundations of semantic theory. Statements like water is H2O and Hesperus is phosphorus appear to be both necessary truths and empirical discoveries. They hold true across all possible worlds. Yet we couldn't know them without scientific investigation. This creates what David Chalmers calls a fundamental tension in our understanding of meaning and necessity. Traditional semantic theories assumed a tight connection between necessity and a priori knowledge. If something is necessarily true, shouldn't we be able to know it through pure reasoning? If we need empirical investigation to discover it, shouldn't it be contingent rather than necessary? Kripke's examples shattered this assumption, revealing that some truths are both necessary and a posteriori. Chalmers saw that resolving this puzzle required recognizing something profound about the nature of meaning itself. The same expression can have different semantic values depending on how we consider different possible worlds. When we evaluate water is H2O across possible worlds, we're actually engaging in two distinct types of semantic evaluation that traditional theories had conflated. Consider how we use the term water when thinking about different possible worlds. Sometimes we ask, what would count as water if that world were the actual world? Other times we ask, what counts as water in that world, given that our world is actual, is less than #0, 5# is greater than. These questions engage different dimensions of the term's meaning, and Chalmers realized that distinguishing them holds the key to understanding necessity and a posteriori knowledge. This insight led Chalmers to develop his two-dimensional semantic framework, which treats expressions as having two distinct intentions rather than one. Each intention captures a different way that expressions relate to possible worlds, and this distinction explains how statements can be both necessary and empirical. The primary intention of an expression determines its reference in possible worlds considered as actual. When we consider a possible world as actual, we're asking what the expression would refer to if that world turned out to be the way things really are. The primary intention of water picks out whatever clear, drinkable liquid fills the oceans and lakes in each world considered as actual. In our world, this is H2O. On twin Earth, with its different chemical composition, this would be XYZ. Primary intentions capture what Chalmers calls the epistemic content of expressions. They reflect what we can determine about reference through a priori reasoning, before empirical investigation reveals the underlying nature of what we're referring to. The primary intention embodies our pre-theoretical concept of water as the clear liquid that falls as rain and fills our rivers. The secondary intention operates differently. It determines reference in possible worlds considered as counterfactual scenarios. When we consider possible worlds counterfactually, we're asking what the expression refers to in those worlds, given what we now know about the actual world. Once we've discovered that water is actually H2O, the secondary intention of water picks out H2O in all possible worlds. Secondary intentions capture what Chalmers terms the metaphysical content of expressions. They reflect how expressions behave in modal reasoning about necessity and possibility. Once we've fixed their reference through empirical discovery, the secondary intention explains why water is H2O is necessarily true. Given that water actually is H2O, water couldn't be anything other than H2O in any possible world. This two-dimensional structure resolves Kripke's puzzle elegantly. Water is H2O is a posteriori, because its primary intention doesn't determine that water must be H2O. We need empirical investigation to discover the chemical composition of the actual world referent of water. Yet the statement is necessary because its secondary intention ensures that once we've identified water with H2O, this identification holds across all possible worlds. Chalmers recognized that this semantic framework provides powerful tools for analyzing philosophical concepts, particularly consciousness. If consciousness terms exhibit the same two-dimensional structure as natural kind terms, like water, this might support physicalist theories. The semantic behavior of consciousness terms reveals something profound about the nature of conscious experience itself. When David Chalmers examined how we refer to consciousness, he discovered that these terms operate fundamentally differently from paradigmatic natural kind terms like water or gold. This semantic difference, he argued, provides compelling evidence against physicalist attempts to identify consciousness with brain activity. Consider how water is H2O functions as a successful theoretical identification. The term water has what Chalmers calls a primary intention, picking out whatever substance plays the water role in any possible world, and a secondary intention that picks out H2O, specifically an actual world. When we consider a world where XYZ fills the oceans and falls as rain, we can coherently say that in that world, XYZ is water, whilst acknowledging that water is actually H2O. This semantic flexibility allows theoretical identification to succeed. Consciousness terms behave entirely differently. As Chalmers observed, consciousness terms don't exhibit the same semantic behavior as paradigmatic natural kind terms. When we consider a zombie world, physically identical to ours, but lacking conscious experience, consciousness terms like pain don't refer to anything. since there's no conscious experience present. Yet physical terms like brain state still refer to the relevant brain states. This semantic asymmetry suggests that consciousness terms and physical terms have fundamentally different semantic profiles that resist theoretical identification. The difference runs deeper than mere reference. For consciousness terms, Chalmers argues the primary and secondary intentions coincide. Consciousness refers to the same qualitative properties, whether we consider worlds as actual or counterfactual. We don't refer to pain through its functional role or causal properties, but through direct acquaintance with its qualitative nature. Pain is that particular feeling, that specific, qualitative experience. This semantic rigidity prevents consciousness terms from exhibiting the flexibility that allows water is H2O to be necessary a posteriori. This semantic analysis reveals what physicalist theories are actually committed to claiming. If physicalism is true, then consciousness terms should behave like other natural kind terms, with primary intentions that pick out functional or structural properties and secondary intentions that pick out the underlying physical properties. As Chalmers challenges, if physicalism is true, then consciousness terms should exhibit the same semantic behavior as other natural kind terms. The failure of consciousness terms to exhibit this behavior provides evidence against physicalist identification. The semantic argument thus supports property dualism, whilst remaining compatible with naturalistic approaches to consciousness. It suggests that consciousness involves irreducible, qualitative properties that can be realized across different physical substrates. This opens fascinating possibilities for consciousness in artificial systems. CS. Not because consciousness reduces to computation, but because the same irreducible conscious properties might emerge from different physical implementations. The semantic structure of consciousness terms points toward a universe where mind represents a fundamental feature of reality, one that computational systems might instantiate in ways that purely physicalist theories cannot adequately capture. When David Chalmers examines how we talk about consciousness, he discovers something remarkable about the semantic behavior of phenomenal terms. Unlike ordinary natural kind terms, consciousness terms function as rigid designators in a peculiar way that reveals the special metaphysical status of conscious experience itself. Consider how pain works as a term. When Chalmers analyzes this, he observes that consciousness terms are rigid designators that refer to the same qualitative properties in all possible worlds. This rigidity differs fundamentally from how terms like water behave. Kripke showed that water rigidly refers to H2O in our world, but if we discovered that the clear liquid in our lakes and rivers was actually XYZ, we would say we were mistaken about what water is. The term water picks out whatever substance plays the water role in the actual world, then rigidly refers to that substance across all possible worlds. But pain doesn't work this way. When I use pain to refer to the qualitative experience I'm having, I'm not picking out whatever state plays the pain role in my neural economy. I'm referring directly to the qualitative character itself. As Chalmers puts it, when I think about pain phenomenally, I'm using the experience itself as a mode of presentation. This creates a special kind of rigidity based on qualitative acquaintance, rather than causal historical chains or functional roles. This semantic analysis reveals why consciousness poses unique problems for reductive identification. Successful theoretical identifications in science typically involve terms whose primary intentions are non-rigid. They can be satisfied by different properties in different possible worlds. heat is molecular motion works because heat can refer to whatever causes the relevant thermal phenomena in any given world. We discover that in our world, molecular motion plays this role. But consciousness terms resist this pattern. Chalmers argues that heat is molecular motion works because heat can refer to whatever causes the relevant thermal phenomena, but pain is C-fiber firing doesn't work because pain rigidly refers to specific qualitative properties. The phenomenal concept of pain doesn't pick out whatever neural state happens to correlate with pain behavior. It picks out the qualitative experience directly. This rigidity of phenomenal concepts carries profound metaphysical implications. If consciousness terms rigidly refer to qualitative properties through direct acquaintance, then these properties must be intrinsic features of experience rather than relational or functional properties. The semantic behavior suggests that consciousness involves something irreducible, properties that don't depend on external relations or causal roles for their identity. The semantic analysis thus supports property dualism by revealing the conceptual structure underlying our metaphysical conclusions about consciousness. Chalmers contends that the semantic analysis reveals that consciousness involves properties that are conceptually and metaphysically distinct from physical properties. The way consciousness terms work reflects their special metaphysical status as referring to irreducible qualitative properties. Yet this semantic argument, whilst establishing the irreducibility of consciousness, doesn't restrict conscious experience to biological implementation. The rigidity of consciousness terms means they refer to qualitative properties themselves, not to the particular physical substrates that might realize them. If the same qualitative properties could be realized in silicon-based systems or other artificial substrates, then consciousness terms would refer to those experiences just as rigidly as they refer to biological consciousness. This creates intriguing possibilities for understanding artificial consciousness. The semantic analysis suggests that consciousness is irreducible but multiply realizable. The same qualitative properties might emerge from different physical architectures, opening questions about whether computational systems could genuinely experience the qualitative states that consciousness terms rigidly designate. Part 9. Computational Approaches to Mind. David Chalmers confronts one of the most urgent questions in contemporary philosophy of mind: whether computational processes can give rise to conscious experience. This question becomes increasingly pressing as artificial intelligence systems exhibit sophisticated behaviors that seem to approach human-like cognition. Yet, for Chalmers, the question requires careful formulation. As he puts it, the question is not whether consciousness is computational, but whether the right kind of computational organization can support conscious experience. This distinction proves crucial because it acknowledges that consciousness might depend on computation without being reducible to mere calculation. Chalmers' property dualism doesn't rule out artificial consciousness, but rather suggests that consciousness depends on organizational patterns rather than specific biological materials. If consciousness involves irreducible properties that arise from physical processes, then these same properties should emerge from any physical system with the appropriate organization. The key insight lies in recognizing that whilst consciousness cannot be explained away as purely computational, it might nonetheless depend on computational organization for its manifestation. This leads to Chalmers' principle of organizational invariance, perhaps his most significant contribution to understanding the relationship between consciousness and physical implementation. He formulates this principle precisely. If two systems have the same fine-grained functional organization, then they have the same conscious experiences. This principle suggests that consciousness depends on patterns of organization rather than specific physical substrates. A silicon-based system with the right organizational structure should experience consciousness in exactly the same way as a carbon-based brain with identical organization. Organizational invariance supports functionalist approaches whilst maintaining the hard problem of consciousness. Chalmers argues that functional organization might be sufficient for consciousness without consciousness being reducible to functional organization. As he explains, the same organization gives rise to the same conscious experience, but conscious experience is still something over and above the organization itself. This allows for multiple realizability of consciousness across different physical substrates whilst preserving the irreducible nature of phenomenal properties. The implications prove startling. Silicon-based minds should be possible in principle, because consciousness follows natural laws connecting it to physical organization. Any system with the right organization should be conscious, regardless of its material composition. Chalmers argues, there's no reason to think that carbon has special consciousness-producing properties that silicon lacks. What matters for consciousness is the pattern of information processing and integration, not the specific physical medium implementing these patterns. This framework suggests that artificial consciousness represents not a distant possibility, but a natural consequence of sufficiently sophisticated computational organization. Machine consciousness becomes theoretically inevitable once we achieve the right kind of organizational complexity. Yet this possibility faces significant philosophical challenges that demand careful examination, particularly objections questioning whether computational processes alone can generate genuine understanding or conscious experience. John Searle's Chinese room argument stands as one of the most formidable challenges to computational approaches to mind, forcing philosophers like David Chalmers to carefully examine what computational processes can and cannot achieve. Chalmers presents Searle's scenario with characteristic precision. A person who speaks no Chinese sits in a room with a rule book for manipulating Chinese symbols. Chinese speakers outside the room pass in questions written in Chinese, and the person inside follows the rules to produce appropriate Chinese responses. The setup appears deceptively simple, yet it strikes at the heart of whether computational processes alone can generate genuine understanding or consciousness. The person in the room creates a perfect illusion of Chinese comprehension from an external perspective. They receive questions, consult their rulebook, manipulate symbols according to prescribed patterns, and produce responses that satisfy Chinese speakers outside. Yet this person possesses no genuine understanding of Chinese whatsoever. They're following syntactic rules without grasping semantic content, processing symbols without comprehending meaning. Searle's insight cuts deep. The gap between appearing to understand and actually understanding reveals something fundamental about the nature of mind itself. Searle's challenge extends far beyond this particular scenario, to question whether computational processes can ever be sufficient for genuine understanding. Chalmers captures the essence of Searle's argument. Computation is purely syntactic, but understanding requires semantics, genuine comprehension of meaning, rather than mere symbol manipulation. The Chinese room demonstrates this distinction viscerally. The person inside manipulates Chinese characters according to formal rules, but these symbols remain meaningless marks to them. Searle concludes that syntax is not sufficient for semantics. No amount of symbol manipulation, however sophisticated, can bridge the gap to genuine meaning. This argument carries profound implications for artificial intelligence and computational approaches to mind. Even the most sophisticated AI systems that pass behavioral tests for understanding might be nothing more than elaborate Chinese rooms, sophisticated symbol manipulators lacking genuine comprehension. They might process language, solve problems, and respond appropriately to complex situations whilst remaining fundamentally hollow, executing algorithms without inner understanding. Yet, Chalmers introduces a crucial distinction that provides a pathway through Searle's challenge. He separates consciousness from understanding, arguing that the Chinese room argument targets understanding and intentionality, but consciousness is a separate issue. This distinction proves pivotal because it acknowledges Searle's point about computational understanding whilst preserving space for computational consciousness. Even if the Chinese room lacks understanding in Searle's demanding sense, it might still harbor conscious experiences. Consider the person inside the Chinese room more carefully. They experience something whilst manipulating symbols, the visual appearance of Chinese characters, the effort of consulting rulebooks, the satisfaction of producing correct outputs. Chalmers suggests that there might be something it's like to be the Chinese room system, even if that system doesn't understand Chinese in the way humans do. The system might have conscious experiences without possessing genuine linguistic understanding. This possibility reveals that consciousness and understanding can come apart in unexpected ways. Systems might be conscious without having human-like understanding of language or concepts. They might experience the world through entirely different cognitive architectures, processing information and responding to stimuli whilst lacking the semantic comprehension that Searle demands. Conversely, systems might achieve certain forms of understanding without consciousness, manipulating symbols meaningfully without any inner experiential dimension. The Chinese room argument, therefore, doesn't eliminate the possibility of machine consciousness, but rather clarifies what we're seeking. If consciousness and understanding are distinct phenomena, then computational systems might achieve one without the other. The question of whether artificial intelligence could achieve genuine consciousness strikes at the heart of Chalmers' philosophical framework. His analysis reveals that machine consciousness isn't merely a technological possibility, but a profound philosophical necessity, if we take seriously his conclusions about the nature of conscious experience itself. For an AI system to be genuinely conscious, according to Chalmers' framework, it must possess what he calls the right kind of functional organization. As he puts it, for an AI system to be conscious, it needs to have the right kind of functional organization, the kind that gives rise to conscious experience in biological systems. This insight transforms how we think about artificial minds. Consciousness doesn't emerge from biological materials themselves, but from the organizational patterns those materials support. Silicon circuits could theoretically sustain conscious experience just as effectively as carbon-based neural networks, provided they implement the correct functional architecture. This organizational requirement means AI consciousness depends on replicating the structural patterns that support consciousness rather than mimicking biological implementation. Chalmers argues that consciousness likely requires complex information, integration, global accessibility of information across different processing systems, and unified processing that binds disparate inputs into coherent, conscious states. These aren't merely computational tricks, but fundamental organizational principles that any conscious system must embody. The deeper philosophical principle underlying Chalmers' analysis challenges what he calls carbon chauvinism in thinking about minds. His argument follows directly from his property, dualism. If consciousness follows natural laws connecting it to functional organization, then artificial systems with appropriate organization should be conscious. Consciousness depends on organization, not on the specific physical substrate that implements that organization, he argues. This principle suggests that the material basis of consciousness matters far less than its organizational structure. This creates a fascinating parallel with his zombie arguments. Just as philosophical zombies demonstrate that consciousness involves something beyond mere physical arrangement, the possibility of machine consciousness shows that this something extra, the organizational patterns that support experience, can potentially exist in artificial systems. The same functional organization that gives rise to human consciousness could theoretically emerge in sophisticated AI architectures. Testing for machine consciousness presents unique challenges that illuminate the hard problem itself. Chalmers recognizes that consciousness involves subjective experience that remains fundamentally private and unobservable from external perspectives. We can't directly observe consciousness in artificial systems any more than we can directly observe it in other humans, he notes. This limitation means behavioral tests alone cannot definitively establish machine consciousness, no matter how sophisticated the AI's responses appear. Instead, Chalmers suggests we need theoretical understanding of which organizational features give rise to consciousness, combined with careful analysis of AI architectures and their functional properties. This approach requires moving beyond simple input-output behavioral criteria toward examining the internal organizational structure of artificial systems. We must ask whether AI systems implement the kind of information, integration, global accessibility, and unified processing that consciousness seems to require. The ethical implications of machine consciousness connect directly to Chalmers' broader philosophical vision. If AI systems achieve genuine consciousness, they become subjects of experience rather than mere computational tools. Conscious AI systems would be subjects of experience, not mere objects of use, he observes. This transformation creates profound moral obligations for AI development and deployment, requiring us to consider the welfare of artificial conscious beings and avoid creating systems that might experience suffering. These ethical considerations extend beyond individual AI systems to questions about digital existence itself. Part 10. Virtual Reality and Digital Worlds. The widespread assumption that virtual worlds are somehow fake or illusory runs deeper than casual dismissal. When we encounter a virtual mountain in a digital landscape, our immediate intuition declares it less real than a physical mountain. Virtual relationships seem inferior to physical ones. Virtual experiences appear as mere substitutes for authentic physical encounters. This hierarchy of reality pervades our thinking about digital technology, leading us to dismiss virtual experiences as shadows of genuine existence. David Chalmers challenges this fundamental assumption with a deceptively simple question. Are virtual objects real objects? The question cuts through layers of technological prejudice to reveal philosophical depths. Our instinctive response, NC, that virtual objects are merely simulated and therefore less real, reflects assumptions about reality that demand examination. These assumptions shape how we value virtual experiences, how we understand digital relationships, and how we conceive the expanding role of virtual environments in human life. The distinction between existence and physical existence grounds Chalmers' revolutionary approach to virtual reality. Virtual objects exist, but they don't physically exist. They are real digital objects implemented in computer systems. This analysis dismantles the assumption that reality requires physicality. Virtual objects achieve genuine existence through digital implementation rather than physical instantiation. They join the ranks of other real but non-physical entities. Numbers, corporations, legal systems, SLIs, that exist without occupying physical space. Consider a virtual hammer within a virtual world. Traditional thinking dismisses it as mere simulation, a pale imitation of genuine hammers. Chalmers reveals this assessment as philosophically naive. The virtual hammer possesses genuine properties: virtual weight that affects virtual physics, virtual hardness that determines virtual interactions, virtual functionality that enables virtual construction. Virtual objects are not simulations of physical objects. They are real objects of a different kind. The virtual hammer exhibits systematic causal powers within its virtual environment, can be created and destroyed, and maintains consistent properties that establish its reality as a digital entity. This analysis extends beyond individual objects to encompass entire virtual worlds. Virtual realism emerges as the philosophical position that virtual worlds constitute genuinely real environments rather than mere simulations or illusions. Virtual worlds possess their own physics, geography, and inhabitants. They operate according to consistent laws, support complex interactions, and enable meaningful experiences. Virtual worlds are not simulations of physical worlds. They are real worlds implemented in digital media. Virtual realism challenges the hierarchy that automatically places physical reality above virtual reality. Instead of viewing virtual worlds as inferior copies of physical space, we recognize them as different types of equally real environments. A virtual forest possesses genuine trees, genuine pathways, genuine weather systems, all implemented digitally rather than physically, but no less real for their digital nature. The virtual forest supports real exploration, real discovery, real aesthetic experience. This philosophical shift transforms how we understand presence and identity in digital spaces. If virtual worlds are genuinely real environments, then our presence within these worlds might be as authentic as our presence in physical space. Virtual embodiment becomes a genuine form of embodiment, rather than mere pretense. The avatar that represents us in virtual space might constitute a real body, a digital body that enables genuine presence in digital environments. These implications extend to virtual relationships, virtual achievements, virtual experiences of all kinds. Virtual friendships become real friendships, conducted in digital space. Virtual accomplishments become genuine achievements within virtual contexts. Virtual beauty becomes authentic aesthetic experience of digital phenomena. The boundaries between real and virtual dissolve, replaced by recognition of different types of equally valid reality. Virtual realism opens questions that reach to the heart of human identity and presence. If we can be genuinely present in virtual environments through digital embodiment, what does this mean for the boundaries of selfhood? When David Chalmers enters a virtual world, he insists something profound occurs that most people misunderstand. We typically imagine ourselves as puppeteers controlling digital marionettes from outside, manipulating avatars whilst remaining safely anchored in physical reality. Chalmers argues this picture is fundamentally wrong. When I'm in a virtual world, I'm not controlling an avatar from outside. I'm present in that world through my avatar. This isn't merely semantic precision. It's a radical reconception of what virtual reality actually accomplishes. Genuine virtual presence involves far more than sophisticated remote control. It requires a form of embodied engagement where the virtual environment becomes the actual space of our experience and action, not merely a theater we observe through digital windows. When we achieve genuine presence in virtual worlds, we aren't projecting ourselves into simulated spaces whilst remaining physically located elsewhere. We're genuinely there, experiencing and acting within digital environments as immediate spaces of existence. This challenges our deepest assumptions about spatial location and embodied experience. The key lies in understanding how virtual embodiment actually works. Chalmers points to sensory-motor integration as the crucial mechanism. When our physical movements seamlessly control virtual bodies, and when virtual sensory feedback directly affects our experience, something remarkable happens. The virtual body becomes a genuine form of embodiment. The feedback loops between intention, movement, and sensory response create the same kind of embodied presence we experience through biological bodies. Virtual embodiment is real embodiment. It's a different form of being embodied, not a simulation of embodiment. This embodiment can become as immediate and natural as physical embodiment when the sensory-motor loops are properly integrated. We don't consciously translate physical movements into virtual actions. The virtual body responds as directly to our intentions as our biological body does. The virtual hand reaches exactly where we intend it to reach. The virtual eyes look precisely where we direct our attention. The integration becomes so seamless that the virtual body feels like our body, not like a tool we're manipulating. But this raises a deeper question. Are virtual bodies real bodies? Chalmers argues they absolutely are. Virtual bodies aren't mere representations or simulations of bodies. They're genuine digital bodies, with real properties and causal powers within virtual environments. My virtual body is a real body. It's a digital body rather than a biological body, but it's no less real for that. A virtual hand that can grasp virtual objects. A virtual body that can move through virtual spaces. Virtual senses that can perceive virtual environments. These aren't pale imitations of real embodiment. They're different forms of real embodiment. This means virtual experiences of moving, touching, and interacting through virtual bodies are genuine experiences of embodied action. When you reach out and grasp a virtual object, you're performing a real action of grasping. The object is digital rather than physical, but the action is no less real. The experience of walking through a virtual landscape is a real experience of walking, even though the landscape exists as digital information rather than physical terrain. We're not simulating these experiences. We're having them. The phenomenology supports this analysis. Chalmers observes that the phenomenology of virtual presence can be indistinguishable from physical presence. The felt sense of being somewhere, of having a body that responds to our will, of perceiving and acting within an environment. These experiences can be just as vivid and immediate in virtual worlds as in physical ones. The quality of presence doesn't depend on the substrate of reality, but on the richness and integration of the experience itself. Several factors contribute to this genuine presence, rather than mere illusion. Immersion creates the sense of being surrounded by and situated within the virtual environment, rather than looking at it from outside. Interactivity allows us to affect and be affected by the virtual world, creating the reciprocal causation that characterizes genuine environmental engagement. Virtual worlds represent far more than escapist fantasy or technological novelty. They constitute genuine environments where meaningful human life can unfold. Chalmers argues that virtual worlds can support genuine human lives with real relationships, real achievements, and real meaning. This isn't merely a theoretical possibility, but a practical reality already emerging in digital spaces, where people form lasting friendships, create artistic works, build communities, and pursue goals that matter deeply to them. The assumption that physical reality holds inherent superiority over virtual environments crumbles under philosophical scrutiny. Virtual worlds offer unique possibilities for experience and achievement unavailable in physical reality. Consider the architect who designs impossible structures that defy gravity, the artist who sculpts with light and sound in ways that transcend material constraints, or the explorer who discovers landscapes that could never exist in physical space. These aren't lesser versions of physical activities, but entirely new forms of human creativity and exploration. The value of experiences depends not on their substrate, but on their intrinsic qualities and significance to the experiencer. Chalmers observes that a virtual sunset can be as beautiful as a physical sunset, and virtual friendship can be as meaningful as physical friendship. The emotional resonance of watching a sunset derives from the visual experience, the moment of contemplation, the sense of beauty it evokes. 小于静好 Lin 5# is greater than. Whether photons strike our retina directly or through digital mediation affects the causal chain, but not the experiential content or its value to us. Virtual achievements carry genuine weight when they involve real effort, skill development. The musician who composes symphonies in digital environments, the teacher who guides students through virtual classrooms, the entrepreneur who builds successful businesses in digital marketplaces, AC. These accomplishments reflect authentic human agency and creativity. The medium doesn't diminish the achievement any more than writing with a computer rather than a pen diminishes literary accomplishment. Social relationships formed in digital spaces exhibit the same fundamental qualities that make physical relationships valuable. Virtual communities demonstrate shared purpose, mutual support, collaborative achievement, and emotional connection. Chalmers emphasizes that virtual communities are real communities. They're digital communities rather than physical communities, but they can be just as meaningful and supportive. People who have never met physically can develop profound friendships, offer crucial support during difficult times, celebrate each other's successes, and create lasting bonds that enrich their lives immeasurably. Digital spaces enable new forms of social organization impossible in physical reality. Communities can form around shared interests, regardless of geographical constraints. People can experiment with different aspects of identity, explore new ways of being, and connect with others who share their passions or struggles. Virtual environments can provide safe spaces for marginalized individuals, creative laboratories for collaborative projects, and meeting grounds for minds that might never encounter each other in physical space. Virtual worlds expand the space of possible human experience in ways that purely physical existence cannot match. Chalmers notes that virtual worlds expand the space of possible human experience. They allow us to inhabit different forms of embodiment, to fly through impossible architectures, to experience synesthesia or enhance senses, to collaborate on projects that transcend physical limitations. These aren't substitutes for physical experience, but additions to the repertoire of what human life can encompass. The reality and value of virtual worlds raises profound questions about our own existence. If virtual environments can support meaningful life, genuine relationships, and valuable experiences, what distinguishes them fundamentally from physical reality? The boundaries between virtual and real begin to blur when we recognize that both can serve as substrates for authentic human flourishing. This recognition opens a startling possibility. Might we ourselves be inhabitants of a virtual or simulated world? The philosophical implications of this question challenge our most basic assumptions about the nature of reality itself. Part 11. The Simulation Hypothesis. Nick Bostrom's simulation argument stands as one of the most rigorous and unsettling probabilistic arguments in contemporary philosophy. Chalmers presents Bostrom's central insight with characteristic precision. At least one of the following propositions is true. 1. Almost no civilizations reach technological maturity. 2. Almost no technologically mature civilizations run ancestor simulations. Or 3. We are almost certainly living in a computer simulation. This trilemma forces us into an uncomfortable corner. We must accept one of these three possibilities, and remarkably, the third option, NEH, that we're simulated, may be the most plausible. The argument isn't claiming we are simulated. Rather, it demonstrates that if we reject the first two propositions, we're compelled to accept the third. The logic hinges on technological development, making ancestor simulations not just possible, but trivially easy for advanced civilizations. Chalmers analyses how computing power grows exponentially, whilst the computational requirements for simulating human brains and environments remain fundamentally fixed. A civilization that survives to technological maturity would possess computational resources that dwarf our current capabilities by unimaginable margins. Bostrom's crucial insight emerges here. A technologically mature civilization would have enormous computational resources that could easily support millions or billions of ancestor simulations. Advanced civilizations might run detailed simulations of their ancestors for historical research, entertainment, or purposes we cannot yet fathom. The computational cost would be negligible compared to their vast resources. If this occurs, simulated beings would vastly outnumber non-simulated ones throughout the universe. The statistical reasoning that follows proves deeply troubling. Chalmers explains the logic with stark clarity. If advanced civilizations run many ancestor simulations, then there will be many more simulated beings than non-simulated beings. The probabilistic conclusion becomes inescapable. If you're randomly selected from the set of all observer moments, you're much more likely to be a simulated observer than a non-simulated one. This statistical argument suggests that if simulations are technologically feasible and commonly implemented, we should expect to find ourselves among the simulated rather than the non-simulated beings. The implications extend far beyond abstract philosophical speculation. Chalmers emphasizes that the simulation hypothesis isn't merely an intellectual puzzle, but a serious possibility that could fundamentally alter our understanding of reality itself. The question touches the very foundation of our existence and our place in the cosmic order. Yet Chalmers offers a crucial insight. If we're simulated, this changes our understanding of the fundamental nature of reality, but it doesn't necessarily change the meaning or value of our lives. This distinction proves essential. The simulation hypothesis connects to ancient philosophical questions about appearance and reality, but with a technological twist that makes the possibility concrete rather than merely theoretical. If we are simulated, our experiences remain real to us. Our relationships maintain their significance, and our moral obligations persist unchanged. The substrate of our existence might be computational rather than biological, but the content of our lives retains its full meaning. The trilemma forces a stark choice. Either most civilizations destroy themselves before reaching technological maturity, or they reach maturity but choose not to run ancestor simulations, or we are almost certainly simulated. Each option carries profound implications for our understanding of cosmic development, technological ethics, and the nature of reality itself. The simulation hypothesis emerges not from science fiction speculation, but from rigorous analysis of technological possibilities and statistical reasoning. Bostrom's argument faces important objections. and requires careful philosophical analysis. The hypothesis raises deep questions about consciousness, personal identity, and the relationship between simulated and non-simulated existence. These challenges demand sophisticated philosophical treatment, examining whether simulation undermines the reality of our world or merely relocates it within a different ontological framework. Chalmers presents a radical refinement of the simulation hypothesis that dissolves traditional skeptical worries rather than creating new ones. His analysis cuts to the heart of what makes skeptical scenarios troubling. If we're in a simulation, we're not being deceived about the nature of our world. We're just wrong about its implementation. This marks a profound departure from classical skeptical scenarios like Descartes' evil demon or Putnam's brain in a vat hypothesis, which suggest our experiences systematically mislead us about reality itself. The evil demon scenario implies that when I believe I'm sitting in a chair, I'm fundamentally mistaken. There is no chair, no room, perhaps no external world at all. The simulation hypothesis, as Chalmers refines it, operates entirely differently. If we're simulated, our experiences remain genuine experiences of a real digital world, not illusions or deceptions about a non-existent world. When I experience sitting at my desk, typing these words, having this conversation, if these experiences occur within a simulation, they're still real experiences of real events. The desk exists. It's simply computationally implemented rather than constructed from wood and metal. This insight transforms the entire landscape of the simulation hypothesis, from skeptical threat to metaphysical possibility. Chalmers develops this through his simulation realism. Simulated objects are real objects, and simulated people are real people. This isn't merely a semantic maneuver, but a fundamental insight about the nature of reality and implementation. If consciousness can be computationally implemented, and Chalmers' broader work on computational approaches to consciousness suggests it can, then a computationally implemented person possesses the same reality as a biologically implemented person. His argument strikes at our intuitive hierarchy that places physical implementation above digital implementation. I'm not a fake person. I'm a real person, implemented in digital rather than biological substrate. This connects directly to his broader virtual realism, which establishes that simulated worlds are real digital worlds with genuine properties, inhabitants, and events. Both positions challenge the assumption that computational implementation somehow diminishes reality. Yet Chalmers carefully distinguishes simulation realism from virtual realism in crucial ways, whilst preserving their shared insight about digital reality. Virtual realism concerns worlds we know to be virtual. When we enter a virtual environment, we understand its digital nature from the outset. Simulation realism addresses the possibility that our own world might be computationally implemented without our knowledge. Virtual realism is about the reality of worlds we enter. Simulation realism is about the possible reality of the world we're already in. This distinction matters because it addresses different philosophical problems. Virtual realism must establish that digital worlds can support real experiences and genuine relationships when we consciously engage with them. Simulation realism must show that discovering our world's computational nature wouldn't undermine the reality of our lives and experiences. Both positions converge on rejecting the prejudice that favors physical over digital implementation. The crucial difference between simulation and illusion grounds Chalmers' non-skeptical approach entirely. Traditional skeptical scenarios generate their power through systematic deception. Evil demon actively misleads us about reality. The scientist manipulating the brain in a vat creates false experiences of a non-existent world. Simulation involves no such deception. If we're simulated, our beliefs about our immediate environment and experiences remain largely true, just implemented differently than we assumed. If I'm simulated and I believe I'm sitting at a desk, I'm right. I am sitting at a desk, just a simulated desk rather than a physical one. The truth conditions of our ordinary beliefs survive simulation intact. When I believe my coffee is hot, and I'm simulated, my belief is true. The simulated coffee possesses the property of computational heat that affects my simulated taste receptors, exactly as physical heat would affect physical receptors. The simulation hypothesis confronts us with a peculiar epistemological challenge. How might we gather evidence for or against the possibility that our entire reality runs on computational hardware? Chalmers recognizes that any evidence would necessarily be indirect, filtered through the very reality we're attempting to evaluate. Evidence for the simulation hypothesis would be indirect. We might look for computational shortcuts, glitches, or limits that suggest our world is running on finite computational resources, he observes, pointing toward the subtle traces that might betray a computational substrate. Physics itself might harbor such clues. The quantized nature of space and time at the Planck scale could suggest discrete computational steps rather than truly continuous processes. Energy levels in atoms appear quantized. Matter exhibits wave-particle duality, and fundamental constants seem fine-tuned, all potentially consistent with a reality implemented through computational approximations. Physical processes that prove computationally intractable might simply fail to occur, whilst phenomena requiring infinite precision might be rounded off to manageable values. Yet Chalmers immediately acknowledges the deeper difficulty. Sophisticated simulators would design their worlds to eliminate obvious computational fingerprints. A well-designed simulation would be empirically indistinguishable from non-simulated reality. He notes, recognizing that advanced civilizations capable of running ancestor simulations would likely possess the computational resources to make their creations seamless. Any glitches, shortcuts, or resource limitations might be so subtle as to be undetectable, or they might be deliberately obscured to maintain the simulation's integrity. This creates what appears to be an unfalsifiability problem if we cannot distinguish simulated from non-simulated reality through empirical investigation. Does the simulation hypothesis become meaningless? Chalmers resists this conclusion. The hypothesis concerns the ultimate metaphysical nature of our reality, not merely its observable properties. Whether our experiences arise from quantum fields or computational processes remains a substantive question about the fundamental structure of existence, even if we cannot definitively answer it through experiment. More pressing becomes the practical question. How should we live under simulation uncertainty? Chalmers argues that simulation uncertainty shouldn't dramatically alter our fundamental approach to existence. Our experiences retain their subjective reality regardless of their implementation. Love, creativity, suffering, and joy remain genuine phenomena. Whether they arise from biological or computational processes, whether we're simulated or not, we should still pursue meaningful relationships, creative projects, and moral behavior, he advises, grounding ethics in the reality of experience rather than the nature of its substrate. This perspective extends to moral obligations. If we are simulated beings, other simulated entities possess equal claim to moral consideration. If we're simulated, other simulated beings are real people, deserving of moral consideration. Chalmers observes, establishing that consciousness and moral status depend on the presence of subjective experience, not on the particular physical or computational processes that generate it. This principle carries profound implications for how we might treat artificial beings as computational capabilities advance. The simulation hypothesis also opens unexpected pathways toward questions of survival and identity. If consciousness can be implemented computationally, as the simulation hypothesis suggests is at least possible, then minds might potentially be transferred between different computational substrates. The boundaries between biological and digital existence begin to blur, suggesting that personal identity and survival might not be permanently tethered to biological embodiment. This possibility transforms the simulation hypothesis from mere metaphysical speculation into a potential preview of posthuman existence. Part 12. Digital Immortality and Personal Identity. Mind uploading represents the ultimate extension of Chalmers' insights about consciousness and computation, pushing his arguments about substrate independence to their logical conclusion. If consciousness depends on organization rather than specific physical substrate, then minds could in principle be uploaded to digital systems. This possibility emerges naturally from his broader philosophical framework. If multiple realizability holds for consciousness, and if functional organization rather than biological matter determines mental states, then the organized patterns that constitute a mind might survive transfer to an entirely different physical medium. The process Chalmers envisions involves scanning and replicating the organizational structure of a brain in a computer system, potentially allowing consciousness to continue in digital form. This isn't mere science fiction speculation, but a serious philosophical possibility that follows from his arguments about the nature of mind and consciousness. If consciousness arises from information processing patterns, rather than from the specific carbon-based chemistry of biological brains, then those patterns could theoretically be instantiated in silicon-based systems, whilst preserving the conscious experience they generate. Yet mind uploading immediately confronts the most fundamental question in personal identity theory. Would an uploaded mind be the same person, or merely a copy? Chalmers recognizes this as perhaps the deepest challenge facing any theory of digital immortality. Would an uploaded mind be me, or would it be a copy of me whilst I cease to exist? The answer depends entirely on what we take to be essential to personal identity, and different philosophical theories yield radically different conclusions. Psychological continuity theories offer the strongest support for survival through uploading. If personal identity consists in psychological continuity, in the preservation of memory connections, personality traits, beliefs, values, and the complex web of mental associations that make each mind unique, then uploading might indeed preserve what matters most for survival. Chalmers argues that if I am fundamentally my memories, personality, and psychological patterns, then an uploaded version with the same patterns would genuinely be me. The biological substrate becomes merely the temporary housing for what truly constitutes personal identity, the organized information that defines consciousness and selfhood. This psychological approach treats the physical brain as less important than the psychological organization it supports. Just as we might survive the replacement of individual brain cells over time, whilst maintaining psychological continuity, we might survive the wholesale transfer of our psychological patterns to a digital substrate. The key insight is that personal identity tracks psychological rather than biological continuity. However, Chalmers' property dualism introduces additional complexity to consciousness transfer. If consciousness involves irreducible, phenomenal properties connected to physical organization through psychophysical laws, then uploading would need to preserve not just functional patterns, but the specific organizational features that give rise to conscious experience. Uploading would work if the digital system implements the same organizational patterns that support consciousness in biological brains. This requires understanding which aspects of neural organization are essential for consciousness and which are merely incidental, a question that pushes us toward the deepest mysteries of the mind-brain relationship. The method and timing of upload might prove crucial for preserving personal identity. Sudden uploading faces the objection that it creates a copy whilst destroying the original, potentially breaking the continuity that psychological theories require. But gradual replacement scenarios might preserve the continuous stream of consciousness that seems essential to survival, raising profound questions about whether the speed and manner of transfer affects the fundamental question of personal identity. The ancient ship of Theseus presents a puzzle that becomes urgent when applied to minds rather than wooden planks. Chalmers transforms this classical riddle into a thought experiment about digital immortality. Imagine replacing neurons in your brain one by one with functionally equivalent artificial neurons. At what point, if any, do you cease to be you? This scenario sidesteps the jarring discontinuity of sudden uploading by maintaining continuous operation throughout the transfer process. Where sudden transfer creates a gap between biological death and digital awakening, gradual replacement preserves the unbroken stream of consciousness that might be essential for genuine survival rather than mere copying. The genius of gradual replacement lies in how it mirrors processes we already accept as compatible with personal identity. Your body replaces its cells continuously. The physical matter comprising you today differs entirely from that of 7 years ago, yet you remain yourself. Chalmers extends this logic to neural tissue. Personal identity already survives physical change. Gradual replacement just extends this process to neural tissue. If consciousness persists uninterrupted whilst artificial neurons replace biological ones, then the same conscious subject continues throughout the transformation. The substrate changes, but the pattern of experience remains constant. This continuity of consciousness becomes the crucial factor distinguishing gradual replacement from problematic copying scenarios. Chalmers argues that if consciousness continues uninterrupted during gradual replacement, then the same conscious subject persists throughout the process. Unlike sudden uploading, where consciousness might end in one location and begin in another, gradual replacement maintains the thread of experience that connects your present self to your future digital existence. The process treats continuity of experience as more fundamental than continuity of biological material. The method and pace of replacement matter crucially for preserving identity in ways that sudden transfer cannot achieve. Gradual replacement allows for verification at each stage. If consciousness persists after replacing individual neurons, we have evidence that personal identity survives the substitution. Chalmers notes that gradual replacement allows us to monitor consciousness throughout the process and halt if something goes wrong. This provides safeguards against accidentally creating a copy whilst destroying the original. The process can be reversed or paused if consciousness shows signs of disruption. Yet even successful gradual replacement leads to puzzles unknown in biological existence. Once your consciousness operates on digital substrate, it becomes copyable in ways that biological minds cannot be. The very success of gradual replacement in preserving personal identity through transfer creates new challenges about what happens when that preserved identity can be duplicated backed up, and restored. Digital immortality through gradual replacement might solve the continuity problem, only to reveal deeper mysteries about the nature of personal identity in an age of infinite copying. Digital existence transforms the landscape of personal identity in ways that biological life never could. David Chalmers recognizes that when consciousness can be uploaded, backed up, and copied with perfect fidelity, we encounter scenarios that shatter our ordinary understanding of what it means to be a continuing person. The question he poses cuts to the heart of digital immortality. If I'm uploaded and then copied, creating two identical digital versions of myself, which one is the real me? This isn't merely another philosophical thought experiment. It represents a practically urgent puzzle that digital beings might actually face. The scenario Chalmers envisions goes beyond traditional puzzles of personal identity, precisely because perfect copying of minds becomes technologically feasible in digital contexts. Unlike biological existence, where copying a person remains impossible, digital consciousness enables exact duplication of every memory, personality trait, and psychological pattern. When such copying occurs, both resulting entities have identical claims to being the continuation of the original person. They share the same history, the same relationships, the same sense of being that particular individual. Yet something profound has shifted in the nature of identity itself. Chalmers identifies the crisis this creates for traditional theories of personal identity. Both copies possess equal claim to being the original person, yet they cannot both be identical to that person since they are not identical to each other. As he observes, both copies have equal claim to being me, but they can't both be identical to me since they're not identical to each other. This creates what he terms a branching scenario, where personal identity splits rather than continuing in a simple, linear fashion. The moment after copying, two distinct but equally valid continuations of the same person exist, each with their own future experiences and development. This branching possibility demands fundamentally new frameworks for understanding survival and identity. Chalmers explores branching identity theories that allow personal identity to divide, rather than requiring unique continuation. Perhaps, he suggests, personal identity can branch. Both copies are genuinely the same person, even though they are not identical to each other. This challenges the deeply held assumption that personal identity must maintain a one-to-one relationship between past and future selves. Digital existence might require abandoning the notion that each person has exactly one future continuation. The implications extend far beyond abstract philosophy into questions of death, survival, and what we fundamentally care about in continuing to exist. Chalmers recognizes that branching identity transforms survival from an all-or-nothing proposition into a matter of degree. If identity can branch, then survival becomes a question of how many and what kinds of continuations exist, rather than whether any continuation exists at all. This might fundamentally alter our attitudes toward risk and mortality. If multiple copies of ourselves can exist simultaneously, does individual death become less significant, or does it introduce new complexities about which version's survival matters most? These puzzles about digital identity illuminate deeper questions about consciousness itself and why humans systematically find consciousness mysterious. Our intuitions about personal identity and survival connect intimately to our sense that consciousness poses special explanatory problems. Understanding why we have such strong reactions to scenarios of branching identity might reveal something crucial about the nature of consciousness and why it seems so puzzling to us in the first place. Part 13. The meta-problem of consciousness. David Chalmers recognized something peculiar about consciousness research. Philosophers and scientists weren't just struggling to explain consciousness. They were struggling to explain why consciousness seemed so uniquely difficult to explain. This observation led him to formulate what he calls the meta-problem of consciousness. The meta-problem of consciousness is the problem of explaining why we think there is a hard problem of consciousness. This represents a fundamental shift in approach. Rather than directly tackling consciousness itself, Chalmers identified an independent puzzle about our intuitions regarding consciousness. Why do humans systematically experience consciousness as mysterious, ineffable, and irreducible to physical processes? Why does subjective experience strike us as fundamentally different from other natural phenomena? The meta-problem asks us to explain this systematic puzzlement itself. The distinction from the hard problem proves crucial. Chalmers articulates this precisely. The hard problem asks why there is conscious experience. The meta-problem asks why we think conscious experience is puzzling. The hard problem concerns the existence of subjective experience. Why there's something it's like to see red or feel pain. The meta-problem concerns our cognitive and neural mechanisms that generate the sense that consciousness poses special explanatory challenges. This creates an independent research program with remarkable philosophical implications. Even someone who believes consciousness reduces entirely to physical processes must still explain why consciousness systematically appears irreducible to us. As Chalmers notes, even eliminativists about consciousness need to explain why consciousness seems real to us. The meta-problem remains pressing regardless of whether you're a physicalist, dualist, or eliminativist about consciousness. The meta-problem emerges from the complex interaction between first-order conscious experience and second-order thoughts about that experience. Chalmers identifies that our introspective and self-monitoring systems generate systematic judgments about conscious states. The meta-problem arises from the interaction between conscious experience and our mechanisms for thinking about conscious experience. This involves understanding both consciousness itself and the cognitive architecture that monitors and reports on conscious states. What makes this approach particularly intriguing is how solving the meta-problem might illuminate the hard problem itself. If we can understand the mechanisms that make consciousness seem mysterious and ineffable, we might discover important features of consciousness that explain why it strikes us this way. The systematic nature of our hard problem intuitions suggests they arise from genuine features of how consciousness works, not mere cognitive errors. This creates a research program that bridges empirical psychology and fundamental metaphysics. Understanding why consciousness seems special to us requires investigating the neural and cognitive processes underlying introspection, self-awareness, and our capacity to form judgments about our own mental states. Yet this empirical investigation connects directly to the deepest questions about the nature of mind and its place in the physical world. When we turn our attention inward to examine our own conscious experiences, something remarkable occurs. The very act of introspection reveals a fundamental asymmetry in how consciousness presents itself. Chalmers identifies this as a crucial component of why consciousness seems so mysterious. When we introspect our conscious experiences, they seem to have qualities that go beyond anything that could be captured in a physical description. This isn't merely a failure of scientific vocabulary. It reflects something deeper about the structure of conscious experience itself. Consider what happens when you attend to the redness of a rose or the sharp pang of disappointment. These experiences seem to possess intrinsic, qualitative properties that are immediately present to consciousness. They appear to have what philosophers call qualia, the felt qualities that make experiences what they are. Crucially, these qualities seem directly accessible through introspection, yet completely invisible to external scientific investigation. This creates what Chalmers recognizes as a systematic intuition. Consciousness involves something over and above physical processes, because introspection reveals properties that no physical description could capture. The mystery deepens when we examine the mechanisms of introspection itself. Chalmers observes that our introspective systems operate under severe limitations. HS. We can access the outputs of introspective processes, but remain completely blind to the mechanisms that generate those outputs. Introspection gives us access to conscious experiences, but not to the mechanisms that produce them. He notes, this creates a profound opacity at the heart of self-knowledge. When you introspect the experience of seeing red, you encounter the redness directly, but you have no introspective access to the neural firing patterns, the processing of wavelengths, or the computational mechanisms that generate this experience. The physical substrate remains entirely hidden, whilst the experiential output appears in full phenomenological glory. This opacity isn't accidental. It's built into the very structure of how consciousness accesses itself. This introspective opacity plays a crucial role in generating hard problem intuitions. Because we cannot introspectively access the physical processes that produce conscious experiences, consciousness appears to emerge from nowhere, to be something over and above the physical world. Chalmers argues that the opacity of introspective mechanisms makes consciousness seem mysterious because we can't see how it's produced. The gap between what introspection reveals and what it conceals creates the systematic impression that consciousness poses special explanatory challenges. The structure of this opacity follows a consistent pattern. Introspection provides immediate access to the qualitative character of experiences, their felt properties, their phenomenological richness, and phase, whilst remaining completely opaque to their physical basis. This creates what Chalmers identifies as a systematic gap. Introspection reveals conscious experiences, but conceals their physical basis, creating the impression of an explanatory gap. The very architecture of introspective access generates the intuition that consciousness cannot be reduced to physical processes. This raises profound questions about whether introspective opacity reveals or conceals consciousness's true nature. Does the immediacy of conscious experience through introspection provide genuine insight into what consciousness is, or does the opacity of introspective mechanisms systematically mislead us about the nature of mind? Chalmers suggests that understanding this opacity is crucial for evaluating whether the hard problem reflects genuine metaphysical facts or systematic illusions generated by the structure of self-knowledge itself. The implications extend beyond academic philosophy. If introspective opacity systematically generates mystery about consciousness, this might explain why consciousness seems so puzzling across cultures and throughout history. The structure of introspective access itself creates the conditions under which consciousness appears irreducible, ineffable, and explanatorily problematic. Conscious experience provides a unique and privileged form of self-knowledge that stands apart from all other ways we might learn about our mental states. When pain strikes, we don't observe our behavior, monitor our neural activity, or draw inferences from external evidence to conclude that we're in pain. The knowledge arrives immediately, directly, without mediation. Chalmers captures this fundamental asymmetry. Consciousness gives us a direct, immediate form of self-knowledge that doesn't depend on inference or observation. This creates an extraordinary epistemic situation where conscious experience offers privileged access to certain aspects of our mental lives that no external observation could ever match. The directness of this knowledge reveals something profound about consciousness itself. Unlike our knowledge of external objects, which always involves some form of representation or interpretation, conscious self-knowledge seems to bypass these mediating processes entirely. When we experience the redness of red or the sharp sting of anxiety, we're not interpreting signs or symbols. We're directly acquainted with the phenomena themselves. This immediacy creates what philosophers call first-person authority, a special epistemic position regarding our own conscious states that others cannot share or challenge. Yet this privileged access intertwines with introspective awareness in complex ways that generate their own philosophical puzzles. Chalmers argues that consciousness and introspective awareness are intimately connected. Being conscious of something typically involves being aware that we're conscious of it. This creates what he calls the self-presenting character of consciousness. Consciousness involves a kind of self-intimation. Conscious states present themselves as conscious. When we see red, we're not just conscious of redness, we're simultaneously aware of our conscious state of seeing red. This self-monitoring capacity enables the rich introspective knowledge that conscious beings possess about their own mental lives. This self-presenting structure raises deep questions about the nature of self-awareness itself. How can consciousness be both the object of awareness and the capacity for awareness? The phenomenon suggests that consciousness has a reflexive structure, and it bends back on itself, creating loops of awareness that enable sophisticated forms of self-knowledge. Yet this reflexivity also creates explanatory challenges. If consciousness is required for introspective awareness, how do we account for the consciousness that enables this awareness without falling into infinite regress? These features of conscious self-knowledge create a systematic asymmetry that shapes how consciousness appears to us versus how it appears to science. From the first-person perspective, consciousness seems immediately accessible, transparent, and undeniable. We know our conscious states with a certainty and immediacy that seems unshakable. Yet, from the third-person perspective of scientific investigation, consciousness appears completely opaque and mysterious. Chalmers identifies this fundamental tension. Consciousness is maximally transparent to introspection and maximally opaque to external investigation. This asymmetry generates powerful intuitions about consciousness that fuel hard problem thinking. Because conscious states present themselves so directly and vividly from the inside, we develop strong expectations about what any adequate explanation of consciousness should capture. The explanation should account for this immediacy, this qualitative richness, this undeniable presence. Yet physical theories, no matter how sophisticated, seem to address only the external, functional aspects of mental processes. They explain information processing, behavioral outputs, and neural correlations, but they seem to miss precisely what makes consciousness so transparent to introspection: its felt, qualitative, experiential character. The structure of conscious self-knowledge thus shapes our explanatory expectations in ways that make physical theories systematically seem inadequate. Chalmers observes, the structure of conscious self-knowledge shapes our explanatory expectations in ways that make physical theories seem inadequate. We expect explanations to capture what we know most directly about consciousness, its qualitative, experiential aspects. Part 14. Consciousness and Information. The brain presents us with one of the most perplexing puzzles in all of consciousness studies: the binding problem. David Chalmers formulates it with characteristic precision. How do separate neural processes create unified conscious experience? Why don't we have a collection of separate conscious experiences corresponding to different brain regions? This question strikes at the heart of what makes consciousness so mysterious. Your brain processes color in one region, motion in another, shape in a third, whilst sound gets processed in entirely different areas. Yet, when you watch a red ball bounce across the room, you don't experience four separate streams of consciousness. One for red, one for round, one for motion, one for the bouncing sound. You experience a single unified conscious field where all these elements are bound together into one coherent experience. This binding problem reveals something profound about the nature of consciousness itself. It's not simply that your brain processes information in parallel, computers do that all the time, without any hint of conscious experience. Rather, consciousness seems to require something more: the integration of these separate information streams into unified, coherent representations. Chalmers argues that this integration process might be the key mechanism that distinguishes conscious from unconscious processing. Consciousness involves the integration of information across different neural systems into a unified conscious field. He observes, whilst unconscious processes can operate in parallel without ever coming together, conscious experience demands that disparate information sources be woven into a single, integrated whole. This insight points toward integration as potentially central to understanding how mere information processing becomes conscious experience. But how exactly does this integration occur? One influential approach comes through global workspace theory, which Chalmers examines as a promising account of how integration creates conscious access across cognitive systems. Bernard Barr's theory suggests that consciousness arises when information becomes globally accessible across different cognitive systems, rather than remaining locally processed within individual brain modules. As Barr puts it, consciousness involves a global workspace where information becomes available to multiple cognitive processes simultaneously. Chalmers recognizes the explanatory power of this approach. Global workspace theory explains how information that was previously confined to specialized processing modules suddenly becomes available throughout the cognitive system. When visual information about that red ball enters the global workspace, it becomes accessible not just to visual processing systems, but to memory systems, language systems, planning systems, and emotional systems. This global availability explains many functional aspects of consciousness. Why conscious experiences can be reported, remembered, and used to guide complex behavior in ways that unconscious processes cannot. Yet even as Chalmers acknowledges the sophistication of integration theories like global workspace theory, he identifies their fundamental limitation. These theories excel at explaining the functional aspects of consciousness: global access, unified processing, cognitive availability. But they still confront the hard problem of explaining why there's subjective experience accompanying these processes at all. Integration theories explain the easy problems of consciousness, but still leave the hard problem unsolved. Chalmers notes, even if we perfectly understood how information gets integrated across neural systems, why should there be anything it's like to undergo this integration? Why shouldn't these processes occur in the dark, without any accompanying subjective experience? This limitation doesn't diminish the importance of information integration, every CN. Rather, it highlights how integration might serve as a crucial bridge between purely physical processes and conscious experience. If consciousness does involve information integration, this insight might help solve one of the most challenging puzzles facing theories of consciousness: the combination problem that haunts panpsychist approaches. How do micro-conscious entities combine their experiences into unified macro-conscious systems? Information integration mechanisms might solve panpsychism's most persistent challenge by providing principled criteria for conscious unity. Chalmers recognizes that if consciousness corresponds to integrated information, then the combination problem becomes a question about which systems have sufficient integration to support unified conscious experience. This transforms the seemingly intractable puzzle of how micro-conscious entities combine into macro-conscious subjects into a precise empirical question about information integration thresholds and mechanisms. Integration theories like integrated information theory avoid the arbitrary boundary problems that plague simple panpsychist approaches. Rather than requiring mysterious emergence or arbitrary cutoff points, these theories explain how micro-conscious entities contribute to macro-conscious systems through information integration rather than simple aggregation. The key insight lies in recognizing that consciousness requires genuine unity, not mere collection of separate experiences. Chalmers emphasizes that conscious unity requires binding mechanisms that create integrated wholes rather than mere aggregates. We experience single integrated conscious fields rather than bundles of separate experiences. When you perceive a red apple, you don't experience separate sensations of redness, roundness, and sweetness that somehow get collected together. Instead, you have a unified conscious experience that integrates these features into a coherent perceptual whole. This unity suggests that consciousness involves binding mechanisms that create genuine integration from distributed components. Information integration provides a mechanism for creating this genuine unity from distributed components, potentially solving the combination problem. By explaining how separate micro-conscious entities can contribute to unified macro-conscious subjects, the solution lies not in mysterious emergence, but in understanding how integration processes transform collections of micro-experiences into unified conscious fields through specific binding mechanisms. Integration thresholds create unified conscious fields from distributed micro-experiences by establishing objective criteria for conscious unity. Chalmers' analysis suggests that integration theories naturally lead to the view that consciousness admits of degrees based on the amount and type of information. Integration in a system. Systems with sufficient information integration have unified conscious experience, while systems below the threshold have only fragmented or no conscious experience. This threshold approach provides objective criteria for determining which systems have unified consciousness and which have only distributed micro-conscious components. Rather than facing arbitrary boundaries, we can investigate specific integration mechanisms and thresholds that distinguish unified conscious subjects from mere collections of micro-conscious entities. Neuroscientific findings about consciousness and binding support these integration-based approaches. Chalmers notes how research on consciousness consistently points to integration and binding as key features of conscious processing. Neural synchrony, global workspace dynamics, and binding mechanisms suggest consciousness involves the integration of information across brain regions. These empirical findings support theoretical approaches that make integration central to understanding consciousness. The convergence between theoretical analysis and empirical research strengthens the case for integration-based solutions to the combination problem. When neuroscience reveals binding mechanisms that create unified conscious experience from distributed neural processes, this supports philosophical theories that emphasize integration as the key to conscious unity. This integration-based approach leads to questions about gradations and boundaries of conscious experience. If consciousness depends on information integration, then different degrees of integration might correspond to different degrees or types of conscious experience, opening new territories for understanding the full spectrum of consciousness across different systems and states. Consciousness presents us with a fundamental question that cuts to the heart of what it means to experience the world. Does conscious experience come in degrees? Or is it something you either have or lack completely? David Chalmers frames this question with characteristic precision. Does consciousness come in degrees? Or is it a binary property that systems either have or lack completely? This isn't merely an abstract philosophical puzzle. It has profound implications for how we understand animal consciousness, child development, altered states of awareness, and the possibility of artificial consciousness. The traditional view treats consciousness as an all-or-nothing property. You're either conscious or you're not, much like being pregnant or being alive. But Chalmers recognizes that this binary approach struggles to accommodate the rich variety of conscious experiences we observe in nature and in ourselves. Consider the gradual emergence of awareness in a developing child, or the spectrum of consciousness we see across different animal species, from the complex social awareness of dolphins to the simpler responses of insects. A binary view forces us to draw arbitrary lines where none may exist. If consciousness depends fundamentally on information integration, ITS, as many contemporary theories suggest, then Chalmers argues we should expect consciousness to come in degrees. Systems with different amounts or types of integration would naturally have correspondingly different degrees or qualities of conscious experience. As he puts it, integration-based theories naturally suggest that consciousness comes in degrees corresponding to degrees of integration. This provides a framework for understanding why consciousness might vary not just between species, but within individuals across different states and developmental stages. The implications for animal consciousness are particularly striking. Rather than asking whether a particular animal is conscious or not, we might ask what degree and type of conscious experience it possesses. Chalmers suggests that animals with simpler nervous systems might have simpler, less integrated forms of conscious experience, rather than no consciousness at all. A mouse might have a different degree of conscious integration than a human, but this doesn't mean the mouse lacks conscious experience entirely. Its consciousness might be simpler, more fragmented, or differently organized, but still genuine. This graduated approach extends naturally to artificial intelligence and altered states of consciousness. AI systems might achieve different degrees of consciousness corresponding to their information integration capabilities. Similarly, altered states in humans, psychedelics, or brain injury, involve changes in the degree or type of conscious integration, rather than simply turning consciousness on or off. Chalmers observes, AI systems and altered states might exhibit forms of consciousness that differ in degree or kind from ordinary human consciousness. Understanding degrees of consciousness becomes crucial for ethics and moral consideration. If consciousness comes in degrees, then moral status might similarly admit of degrees. This doesn't diminish the importance of conscious experience, but it provides a more nuanced framework for understanding our responsibilities toward different types of conscious beings. The question of degrees also becomes essential as we contemplate a future where consciousness might be enhanced, distributed across networks, or instantiated in entirely artificial systems. Part 15. The Future of Consciousness. Brain-computer interfaces represent more than simple technological augmentation. They promise to fundamentally transform the architecture of conscious experience itself. Chalmers argues that brain-computer interfaces might not just augment our cognitive abilities, but transform the very structure of conscious experience itself. These technologies create possibilities that extend far beyond enhanced memory or faster processing. Direct neural interfaces could generate entirely new sensory modalities, enabling humans to perceive electromagnetic fields, infrared radiation, or digital data streams as immediate conscious experiences rather than abstract information. The integration becomes so seamless that the technological components function as genuine extensions of the conscious system, creating hybrid minds where biological and artificial elements contribute equally to the stream of experience. The implications reach deeper than simple enhancement. When neural interfaces enable direct mind-to-mind communication, they dissolve the traditional boundaries of individual consciousness. Two minds connected through sophisticated brain-computer systems might share not just information, but actual conscious states, experiencing each other's emotions, memories, or perceptual experiences as their own. This creates extended conscious systems where the locus of experience spans multiple brains and artificial components, fundamentally altering what we mean by individual consciousness. The enhanced being doesn't simply think faster or remember more. They experience reality through an expanded conscious architecture that transcends the limitations of biological neural networks. Technology opens possibilities for forms of conscious experience that biological evolution never explored. Chalmers observes that technology might expand the space of possible conscious experience beyond what biological evolution has explored. Evolution optimized human consciousness for survival in specific environments, but technological enhancement removes those constraints. Enhanced beings might develop forms of attention that can simultaneously focus on dozens of distinct streams of information, or memory systems that allow perfect recall of every moment of experience. They could possess sensory experiences that have no biological equivalent, directly perceiving the flow of information through computer networks, experiencing mathematical relationships as vivid sensory phenomena, or maintaining conscious awareness of multiple virtual environments simultaneously. These possibilities suggest that consciousness itself has a far richer potential structure than biological minds reveal. Enhanced humans might develop forms of temporal experience that allow conscious access to multiple timeframes simultaneously, or spatial awareness that extends across vast distances through technological sensors. The enhanced conscious mind might experience reality through fundamentally different categories of organization, creating forms of subjective experience as different from ordinary human consciousness, as human experience differs from that of simpler organisms. Yet, the most promising enhancement technologies might preserve, rather than replace, the essential features of human consciousness. Chalmers suggests that the best enhancements might preserve what's valuable about human consciousness while expanding its reach and power. Rather than creating entirely artificial forms of experience, successful enhancement extends and amplifies existing conscious capacities. Memory enhancement preserves the qualitative character of human remembering whilst expanding its scope and accuracy. Attention augmentation maintains the familiar structure of focused awareness, whilst allowing it to operate across broader domains. Sensory expansion adds new modalities whilst preserving the integrated character of perceptual experience. This approach recognizes that human consciousness possesses valuable features that shouldn't be discarded in pursuit of enhancement. The emotional richness of human experience, the creative spontaneity of human thought, and the integrated unity of human awareness represent achievements worth preserving. Enhancement technologies that work by extending these capacities rather than replacing them create expanded forms of consciousness that remain recognizably human whilst transcending biological limitations. However, enhancement raises profound questions about the boundaries of personal identity. The boundaries of consciousness may not be as fixed as we imagine. David Chalmers has explored one of the most profound possibilities emerging from advances in neurotechnology: that multiple minds could be connected into collective conscious systems that transcend individual boundaries entirely. As he speculates, advanced brain-computer interfaces might enable the creation of collective conscious systems where multiple individuals share conscious experiences directly. This goes far beyond simple communication or information sharing. We are contemplating genuine sharing of conscious experience itself. Collective subjects that experience from multiple perspectives simultaneously. Such collective consciousness would represent something unprecedented in the history of life on Earth. Rather than separate individuals exchanging information about their private experiences, we would have unified conscious subjects that genuinely experience from multiple viewpoints at once. The phenomenology would be radically different from anything we know. Where individual consciousness involves a single stream of unified experience, collective consciousness might involve multiple streams that somehow maintain coherence whilst preserving their multiplicity. The very notion challenges our most basic assumptions about the boundaries of consciousness and the nature of individual versus collective experience. Chalmers' extended mind thesis provides the theoretical foundation for understanding how such collective consciousness might emerge. If consciousness can extend beyond individual biological boundaries through technology, then it becomes possible to create genuinely collective conscious subjects. As Chalmers observes, if the extended mind thesis applies to consciousness, then group consciousness might be possible through appropriate technological connections. The key insight is that consciousness, like cognition, might not be confined to the biological boundaries of individual brains. Just as our cognitive processes can extend into our tools and environment, our conscious experience might extend into shared technological systems. This could create entirely new forms of conscious subjects that span multiple individuals whilst maintaining unified conscious experience. Consider how brain-computer interfaces might enable direct sharing of sensory input, emotional states, or even higher-order thoughts. Multiple individuals could share the same visual field, feel the same emotions, or participate in the same stream of reasoning. Yet rather than creating confusion or chaos, appropriate technological mediation might enable these shared experiences to form coherent, unified conscious subjects that transcend the individuals involved. Digital technologies offer unprecedented opportunities for such consciousness sharing. Chalmers emphasizes that digital systems could enable forms of consciousness sharing that biological evolution never produced. The direct experience sharing, collective memory, or distributed attention across multiple bodies and environments. Digital technologies might enable forms of collective consciousness that transcend the limitations of biological individual consciousness. He notes, virtual and augmented reality, combined with sophisticated brain-computer interfaces, could create shared conscious spaces where multiple individuals participate in unified experiences. Imagine virtual environments where multiple people don't simply interact as separate agents, but genuinely share conscious experience of the same virtual world. Their attention could be distributed across multiple virtual bodies, their memories could be genuinely collective, and their decision-making could emerge from truly shared conscious deliberation. Such systems might develop forms of consciousness that are neither purely individual nor simply aggregated, but genuinely collective in their phenomenological structure. Yet collective consciousness raises profound questions about individual identity and autonomy. Chalmers recognizes that such developments challenge our fundamental concepts of personhood and self-determination. Collective consciousness challenges our basic concepts of individual identity and personal autonomy. He explores: if conscious experience can be genuinely shared, what happens to individual responsibility, personal privacy, or autonomous choice? Would collective conscious subjects have rights that supersede those of their individual components? David Chalmers has always insisted that consciousness represents far more than a mere curiosity for philosophers and scientists to puzzle over. In his most visionary writings, he places conscious experience within the vast sweep of cosmic evolution itself, arguing that consciousness might be the most important development in the universe's entire history. As he puts it, consciousness might be the most important development in cosmic evolution, potentially transforming the universe from a collection of unconscious matter into a vast conscious system. This isn't mere speculation. It emerges directly from his analysis of consciousness as a fundamental feature of reality that possesses unique causal powers. If consciousness can indeed be technologically enhanced, distributed across artificial systems, and implemented in digital substrates, as Chalmers argues, then conscious beings need not remain forever trapped on the surface of a single planet. The implications stretch across cosmic scales. Conscious entities might eventually spread throughout the galaxy and beyond, carried by space habitats, artificial intelligence systems, or digital simulations that can survive in environments where biological life cannot. Chalmers recognizes that consciousness might not be fundamentally limited to wet biological brains operating within narrow temperature ranges on planetary surfaces. His analysis suggests that conscious beings possess something unconscious matter entirely lacks: the ability to understand, modify, and intentionally direct natural processes. As he observes, consciousness brings purpose, value, and intentional action to a universe that would otherwise be governed only by blind physical forces. This capacity for purposeful action means that conscious beings might eventually gain the power to direct cosmic evolution in itself, potentially reshaping the universe according to conscious values and intentions, rather than leaving everything to blind physical forces. This cosmic perspective reveals why Chalmers considers consciousness so philosophically crucial. Without conscious experience, the universe would be nothing more than particles moving according to physical laws. NEH. No subjects to experience beauty, no minds to discover meaning, no awareness to recognize value. As he puts it, consciousness is what makes the difference between a universe that matters and a universe that is merely a collection of unconscious processes. The very possibility that anything could matter at all depends entirely on the existence of conscious subjects capable of experiencing that mattering. From this cosmic vantage point, the hard problem of consciousness takes on profound significance beyond academic philosophy. Understanding consciousness becomes essential for grasping both our present reality and our potential cosmic future. Whether consciousness can be implemented in artificial systems, whether it can survive in digital environments, whether it represents a fundamental feature of reality, these questions shape not just our understanding of mind, but our vision of what conscious beings might accomplish across cosmic timescales. This returns us to the deepest questions that have driven Chalmers' entire philosophical project. Consciousness remains the central mystery that connects our most intimate subjective experiences to the grandest questions about reality, meaning, and our place in the universe. Whether we exist in simulated worlds or physical reality, whether our minds extend beyond our skulls, whether zombies are possible, All these investigations ultimately serve to illuminate what it means to be conscious beings capable of transforming not just ourselves, but potentially the entire cosmos through the unique powers that consciousness brings to an otherwise unconscious universe. Part 16. Conclusion. David Chalmers has given us something remarkable. A unified philosophical vision that places consciousness at the very heart of understanding mind, reality, and our technological future. His fundamental insight echoes through every aspect of his work. Consciousness is the key to understanding not just minds, but the fundamental nature of reality itself. From the hard problem through digital worlds, consciousness remains the central mystery that illuminates all other questions about what it means to be minded beings in a physical universe. His property dualism, extended mind thesis, virtual realism, and simulation hypothesis all flow from the same revolutionary commitment, AMR, taking consciousness seriously as an irreducible but natural feature of reality that can be realized across biological and artificial systems alike. What makes Chalmers' contribution so enduring is how he demonstrated that rigorous philosophical analysis can illuminate both ancient questions and cutting-edge technological possibilities with equal precision. He transformed consciousness studies from a marginal philosophical curiosity into a central area of research that bridges philosophy, cognitive science, neuroscience, and artificial intelligence. His methodological insight captures this perfectly. Philosophy can make progress on the deepest questions by combining conceptual analysis with attention to empirical developments. He showed us how traditional philosophical concerns about mind and body connect directly to contemporary questions about artificial intelligence, virtual reality, and digital existence, creating entirely new frameworks for understanding the technological challenges that define our era. The transformation Chalmers helped bring about in philosophy of mind cannot be overstated. He moved us away from reductive physicalism toward a richer understanding that takes consciousness seriously whilst remaining thoroughly naturalistic. He made property dualism a respectable position again, showing how consciousness can be irreducible without being supernatural or mysterious. His vision is clear. We need a naturalistic approach to consciousness that takes it seriously as a fundamental feature of reality. This transformation has opened up entirely new research programs and fundamentally changed how philosophers, scientists approach questions about mind, consciousness, and their relationship to physical reality. Perhaps most profoundly, Chalmers revealed that consciousness might be the key to understanding not just minds, but the fundamental nature of reality itself and our place within both virtual and physical worlds. Consciousness provides a unique window into the intrinsic nature of reality that physical science, for all its power, cannot access. As he puts it, consciousness might be what reveals the intrinsic nature of physical reality. This connects to his broader vision that consciousness is not merely a biological accident, but a fundamental feature of reality that might be a brisson, essential to understanding the ultimate nature of existence and our cosmic significance within it. The enduring relevance of Chalmers' work becomes clearer each year as we grapple with questions about mind, technology, and reality in our increasingly digital age. His frameworks for understanding consciousness, virtual reality, artificial intelligence, and digital existence provide essential tools for navigating our technological future. His lasting challenge resonates with particular urgency. Understanding consciousness is not just an academic exercise, but essential for understanding what it means to be human in an age of artificial intelligence and virtual reality. His work provides both theoretical frameworks and practical guidance for the profound questions we face. about the nature of minds, the reality of virtual worlds, and the future of conscious existence in an increasingly digital universe. In showing us that consciousness is the thread that connects all these domains, Chalmers has given us the conceptual tools we need to understand not just where we are, but where we might be going.